Welcome everyone to another episode of the Cinematic Realms. But this is a special edition, Knights of Keira edition of Cinematic Realms. Which it's been a little while since we've done. Uh, we did do one number of months back for this shirt's name, say Pirates of the Caribbean. Um, an anniversary stream, but it's been even longer before that since we've just done a not you know super popular mainstream franchise edition of Keira Knightley Talk. For anybody who comes to watch this who has not watched the older episodes, this is a big thing for Jared and me. We are both huge fans of one Keira Knightley, and together with our good friend AR, we have ourselves a little fan community with some other members who kind of come in and out, that we call the Knights of Keira. Is it nerdy? Yes, but we own it. But I'm really excited to get to do this talk today because, for one thing, Atonement is a film that I've wanted to talk about ever since I started this channel. And for some reason, I've just never gotten around to it. The timing wasn't right. Uh, just other factors. I think, well, AR hadn't seen Atonement for the longest time. So when they were co-hosting, we it got put off for that reason, and then they left the channel. And but now you and I are doing it, and we both have definitely seen the film a multitude of times, and so now we're going to talk about it. The other reason why I just it goes back to the beginning again of the channel when you and I did our Pride and Prejudice conversation, which is still, for my money, one of the best discussions that's ever been had on the channel. Certainly one of my favorite that I've ever been a part of. And this feels like it's the long-awaited sequel to that. Just because the two films are so closely tied together. I told you as much off screen that that I wanted to make a note to actually watch both of these films prior to our discussion today because they're so closely linked for me. And I'm glad because this is not an uplifting movie. So it was nice to have the counterbalance, but I enjoyed watching them both, and it really brought me back to that early era of my Keira Knightley fandom in 2005 2007. So I had a, despite the rough nature of the movie, I did have a very good time revisiting. Um, why don't you go ahead and talk for a little bit about? Did you see this movie initially when it came out, or when did you come to this, and also in relation to Pride and Prejudice?
So I did not see Atonement in the theater. It came out in 2007. I would have been a freshman in college at that time. I was kind of busy with other stuff. But I was aware of it because I was in the area, hey Stephanie, when I was following the Oscars, and I had seen Pride and Prejudice by that point and loved it. And I was very enamored with Miss Keira Knightley after, Pirates of the Caribbean and Pride and Prejudice. So I knew she had a movie out. I knew that it was getting a lot of acclaim. I knew it was about kind of powerful but tragic subject matter. But I didn't see it right away. I caught up with it a couple years later. And I'm very glad that I've had the chance to revisit it multiple times because this is the kind of movie that you really have to rewatch at least twice to really kind of fully appreciate the story that it's telling, because the story it's telling is not the story that you think it is, and that is very much the point, or one of the many points that this movie makes quite eloquently. And when I first saw it, my overwhelming takeaway was the tragedy of the story itself, And because when you go into the movie, Keira Knightley and James McAvoy are on the poster, you really think of it much more as this is their story, and this is what we're, it's a story of two lovers tragically separated who will, and find their way back to each other. But ultimately, what you come to realize is that they are central figures in the story, but they are not the ones telling the story. And that, again, is also very much the point, because this movie really plays with ideas of perception and authorial intent, the author as God, what the author has a right to say, what they can possibly do to, within the confines of the written word, to make right a great wrong that was done years ago. And when you watch the movie from that perspective, it becomes a very different movie, and it becomes, in my mind, an even richer and more powerful movie, even if the tragedy is perhaps deepened even more than being lessened. And I would say that, I've rewatched it multiple times since, and every time I rewatch it, I get something new out of it. And whether that's just where I am in my life is at a different point, or it's what I'm in the mood to particularly be focusing on. But this movie is a movie that really, I feel like, when you come to it from your perspective, very much as the movie focuses on the perspectives of these different characters, you will have a different experience with it every time. And that's why it's a movie I've continued to find rewarding to rewatch, and not just for, the power of the story itself, but to see like how I personally am engaging with it again. And, and so I'm very glad that I have the opportunity to talk about it with you, so I can get your perspective, because as you alluded to, we have talked about this movie amongst ourselves, and we did talk about it on the channel very briefly because, back before I was John's co-host, I was kind of, the first couple streams I came onto the channel as a guest were Keira Knightley streams, Pride and Prejudice, as you alluded to, Colette, but we also did a special kind of focus on Keira Knightley's stream where we talked about like half a dozen or more movies with AR, as you alluded to, and Atonement, was one of those movies. But as you mentioned, it was the movies we were discussing that AR hadn't seen. And so it was just you and I talking about it. And because we wanted to keep AR included in the conversation, we kind of kept that section a little bit shorter. But I just went back and rewatched it yesterday just to kind of get a sense of what we had talked about then. And I'm like, oh my God, there's so much here, even in like the 20 minutes that we talked about. Like, we go hard on the themes and the ideas, and I'm like, when we get the chance to talk about this movie in detail amongst ourselves, I think it's going to be an incredibly interesting and rewarding discussion. So I hope that sets the stage and doesn't set expectations too high. But I've been wanting to talk about this one for a while.
And by the way, I should mention we did try to get AR on for this discussion because she has since seen the movie, and we wanted to do a reunion of all the Knights of Keira, but her schedule is quite busy these days, so their schedule is quite busy these days, and they weren't able to come on and join us. So yeah, and that would have been interesting because I know they have a certain perspective on this film coming to it just in the last couple of years, and that's something we will get into a bit, because the world in which this movie premiered is not the same world in which we exist today, and so it's interesting to ponder if this movie would have been made and during this current age of discourse and all that. But I think it tells a very unique story, and so we'll talk about that a bit later. But first, I want to just again talk about how I how I came to this movie. You mentioned about the first time you're seeing this movie, you're not quite set up or prepared for what the story is going to be. I was in a unique position because I actually had read the novel before going to see the film, pretty much because I had heard that this movie was being made shortly after Pride and Prejudice had come out, and then a preview for the film came out earlier in the year before, the earlier in 2007, I guess. It probably came out because the film was released in the UK number of months earlier. So I think they were doing the promotion for this film quite earlier in the year. And so I pretty much did everything to psych myself up for this movie. I ordered the book off Amazon. The soundtrack was available for months before the film came out in the UK or in the US. And which, by the way, yes, I do still have that original copy of the soundtrack. Look, they even had different cases than us back then. See, the sides are curved like that. Very interesting.
It was what was called a CD, which some people may not know what that is these days.
Oh yeah, like forget not recognizing the type of CD case. Do all of you know what a CD is? It's these things that I still buy. No, so I was just like, I was approaching this as if it was, the release of the Lord of the Rings. I was that hyped in advance because obviously, and we've gotten into this in other streams, but when I saw Pride and Prejudice, like I had a crush on Keira Knightley when I saw Pirates of the Caribbean, but I mean, there's no need to paint a delicate brush, and I'm not saying anything I haven't said a million times before, but after Pride and Prejudice, I say was as if it's past tense, but I seriously fell madly in love with Keira Knightley, point blank. So I was just like itching for this movie to come out. And so by the time it came out, I had read the book. I had listened to the soundtrack like over and over and over. Like, if I didn't absolutely love this movie, it was going to be a big disappointment. But I went in and it was such a powerful experience, and by the time it got to the library scene, my heart was racing, and I nearly had a heart attack. But so I absolutely adored the film. It was, shocker, my favorite film of the year. And despite the number of accolades it received, it was not nearly enough, in my opinion. But yeah, so my experience with this movie was crazy, and so yeah, I just, so I'm always going to be approaching it from that perspective, and watching it this morning just brought me right back to that particular time in my life. Yeah, and which is, and it's a very odd juxtaposition because obviously I was going through, that was the inception of my, Keira fanboy, really coming into that, and yet it's a very tragic, sad story and a difficult film to watch. But to counterbalance the tragedy, you have Keira in the green dress, which everybody knows. So yeah, just real quick, I want to say hi to some people who have and we already said hi to Stephanie and Guilty Undertaker, and I see Wheezy Squeezebox is joining us. Great to see you. Thank you guys for tuning in. Never know who's going to tune in for some of these streams when it's just Jared and I, really, as we say, doing one for us, which seems to be happening more and more, but that's okay.
Don't do it for the views.
This can be argued.
Well, I mean, one thing I did notice in my preparation for this stream, I noticed the dress has its own Wikipedia page, which is not something you can say about a lot of movie costumes. So it was iconic, and there it is in all of its beauty, and the dress.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I just have a couple pictures. For those, that's a joke. I have about a total of at least 80 pictures for this stream today. 90% of which, you guessed it, are you know who, Miss Keira Knightley. Oh yes. Anyway, so yes. Back to the movie itself, and not just how great she looks in the green dress. Stay objective, John. But yeah, so it's my love of this movie is just off the charts, and like I said before, it seems very much to be bound up with Pride and Prejudice, because it felt like going from one movie straight into another, even though, strange to think now, there were 2 years between the films, but they were very much felt like they were coming one right after the other, and the two films definitely feel like companion pieces in that way. I often refer to the Joe Wright, Keira Knightley trilogy, talking about these two movies along with Anna Karenina, but Anna Karenina feels like it's an encore. Like they came back to gift us with that, but these two films really do feel like they're of a piece together, even though they're very different films. But because of the collaboration between Keira and Joe Wright, and so much of the crew just carried over. I'd venture to say there's probably fewer different crew members, then were the same. It's because I know the cinematographer is the same, or I think so. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm going to double check on that right now. But I know a lot of the costume design, all that stuff is the same. The composer is the same. Dario Marianelli has worked a lot with Joe Wright, and his work across all three of the Keira Joe Wright collaborations are just stunning. Some of the best musical scores written for film, and he rightfully won an Oscar for this film. And I think Guilty Undertaker mentioned before about the typewriter sounds. Mm-hmm. It's so great because I do want to start off talking about the opening of this movie, because one of the big reasons why right off the bat this feels like a companion piece to Pride and Prejudice is just the way that it opens with the focus features and working title logos, and then you hear the birds chirping in the background. Same exact as Pride and Prejudice, and then you start to hear piano, but the difference is the use of the typewriter and how it punctuates the letters of the opening credits. And then you get it throughout the film, and not just with on-screen titles, but with they use it for when Briony is walking down the hallway of the hospital, and the lights are turning on. And every time a light turns on, you hear the punctuation of the typewriter, and it's just and there's speaking of like music, the music actually being used in the film. One of my favorite moments comes when earlier in the film when Cecilia is going through the house just before her encounter with Robbie, um, and the piano is going, and it stops when she pulls on the piano string, and it just brings like an abrupt musical end to the score for that scene. And I love when like actual like on screen, you know, sound effects are used to punctuate the music in a score. I just there's a moment like that early on in Gangs of New York, which is entirely different but sort of same principle. And I always get you know a lot of joy out of that because it's sort of winking at the audience with the music. But yeah, um, so where was I going with it? Just the similarities between the two films, and Dario Marianelli's score is a big part of that. Does this count as my music talk? I think I went for a good while.
I mean, we had to get to it at some point, and then it's always appropriate because music is such an essential part of the movies, especially the movies that we love. But it's particularly important for this movie for multiple reasons. One being the simple fact that the music was one of the most acclaimed aspects of this movie. As Eric points out in the chat, it was a masterclass in how to match the score with what was happening on screen. And that's something I really wanted to delve into because this is not the typical period piece score. You know, this is actually kind of a different type of period piece, even for period piece Queen Keira Knightley, because this does not take place in, Regency era England or, or pre, Bolshevik Russia, like where there's like grand costuming and everything. Like this is a pre-World War II story. It's much more modern, but the score in particular, Dario Marianelli won his Oscar for this. This movie was nominated for 7 Oscars. This unfortunately was the only one it won, but damn was it a deserved win because it is one of the best pairings of musical score and the way it's used to set tone and pace and tell story that I've ever seen in a movie. And when we think back to the previous brief conversation we had in our Focus on Keira Knightley stream a couple of years ago, when we talked about the score, I talked about the fact that the score, even though it relies heavily on the piano and the percussion instruments like the typewriter, as you mentioned, it is not the typical orchestral, flowing, romantic, sweeping kind of score in parts that we often laud on this channel. It has elements of it, like the Elegy at Dunkirk is a stunning piece of music, but in a lot of parts, the score is jarring. That is the word that I thought about a lot when I was listening to it, because it moves very fast from the jump. It does not ease you in with like a grand overture. It like from the moment the movie starts, the score is at a very fast tempo, and it almost feels unsettling because what you're watching on screen doesn't seem to warrant the kind of, almost anxiety-provoking quality that this rapid piano might have at times. But you soon realize why that is, and it's because these events are being set in motion as we speak, as the typewriter is clacking away. And this movie opens ironically with the line that will come to have a different context later in the movie, where Briony is working on her play, and her first words are, "I've finished it." So, and it's because we will soon see that this is all part of a larger design. And one of the things that stuck out to me the most in this on this viewing is, and I do want to talk more separately about Briony's like authorial, the intent in the way it overshadows this movie, especially on rewatch. But, you know, the opening scenes of this movie become all the more urgent once you're rewatching them, and you know that this isn't just, you know, like easing us into it. This is like we're into the heart of the story immediately, and so the score kind of is picking up right at that pace. And part of that is the idea that, you know, as you're reflecting on these events, you start to realize that Briony herself is feeling the urgency of the moment in her mind, thinking back 60 years. But because she knows what's coming, we as the audience do not yet. But this is going to be the most important and most inconsequential day in the life of many different people. Her life, Robbie's life, Cecilia's life, Lola's life. So, and it's, you know, events are going to be set in motion today that cannot be undone. And once you hear that, you like the score and the choices in that scene makes so much more sense. And but it doesn't feel any less anxiety provoking. It feels like it creates a sense of dread once you know what's happening.
Yeah, and I do want to just talk about the, you know, going back again to talk about the music. It's so so much of this score, you know, you talked about it's, you know, it's not a, it has a lot of traditional instrumentation outside of the typewriter, but it is very like it's designed to put you on edge immediately and throughout, like especially throughout that first act. Um, and I do think you're right. I think that's like we're in Briony's sort of her mental state, and this day that's being shown to us is not just showing that something very tragic is about to take place, but it puts you inside her mind of the way that she goes back and runs through this day, probably in her head again and again and again, and it's just yeah. So it puts you in a very tense frame of mind. It's designed, and the music, the way it's constructed, is designed to get your pulse racing, and that works in tandem with the editing, especially like the opening sequence that she's you know, running through the hallways, and the way that the typewriter sound is not just the actual typing of the keys, but then, you know, pushing it to the side as she opens the door to give that sort of screeching sound. You know, it's just so masterful. You know, it's like we are joining. We're not easing into a story like with the opening of Pride and Prejudice, where, you know, it starts off in a bit of sort of silence as we creep up to Briony, but then as soon as she takes that last page out of there, we're into a story that's already running, you know, full steam ahead. And yeah, it's just so beautiful the way it's done. And this is a good opportunity to just take a minute and sing the praises of Saoirse Ronan.
Yes.
Because like for the people who weren't there or weren't paying attention at the time, oh my God, this was such an incredible entrance of a young actress. Because this was, even though I think she was filming Lovely Bones at about the same time as this, maybe before, maybe a little after. She looks a little older in Lovely Bones. So
yeah, I Lovely Bones is listed as 2009. This was 2007. I don't think this is her, at least according to her IMDb page. Wasn't her film debut, but this was absolutely the role that introduced Saoirse Ronan at 13 years old to the world. And she was nominated for an Oscar for it, as the one performance from this movie that was recognized. But it is honestly one of the best child acting performances ever, even though she's only in like the first half of the movie.
I've heard numerous interviews from Keira Knightley where she is just like, somebody asked, like, was it obvious that she was going to be as great as she was? And she said, "Oh yeah, it was absurd. Like, she was like perfect right from the inception." Um, doing this perfectly clipped English accent, and and just so like, yeah, she's just astonishing. And I remember seeing this for the first time and being like, just holy shit. And there's a reason why, um, I have some grumbles about the lack of other acting nominations for this movie at the Oscars, but you can see why, even if the Academy was not as warm towards this film as I wish they had been, there was no refusing, her supporting actress nomination. Uh, she was a shoo-in for that, and it just absolutely astonishing. Um, and yeah, it's, although I will say it is funny now, knowing her as in, knowing the adult Saoirse Ronan through other films, and being like, when we see adult Briony and in this movie, we're like, no, I've seen the grown-up version. That's not her. but yeah, no, it's she's just astonishing, and a huge part of like why this film is as amazing as it is. And it's just, it's such a tragic story, for everyone involved, and that includes Brian. She just, when you see, where this story leads for her, as she's on the verge of, she's getting close to death at the end of the story, and this has become her whole life, and she's never been able to move on from this, and so Saoirse Ronan has such a huge weight on her shoulders in the opening of this film, to just sort of sell this most consequential of days, and to sort of show the thought process of, a child who's seen things which she just doesn't understand at this point in her life. And and I know when the film came out, there were a lot of people who unfortunately were like, oh, they hated her character, but that's not in the film. I think the film very much, um, as shows that this is a tragedy for all three characters, and um, and yeah, I just feel like more and more every time I go back to this movie, I feel the weight of that, that tragedy, and I'm just wowed by her performance. It is one of, I think, beyond just being one of the best uh, performances from a child actor, it's just one of the best performances in any film I've ever seen. She's absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, and she has obviously an incredibly challenging role, because this is not the typical performance where, the child actor is having to reckon with, material that they are, like where they're essentially supporting the adults. She is our focal point here for the early parts of the story. We are, we talked about this movie through at the outset through our love of Keira Knightley, and she is outstanding in this movie herself. But Briony is the main character of this story, and Saoirse Ronan as young Briony, like, we start with her perspective, and it is important that we later learn to see other perspectives throughout the movie. That is actually something that goes into the making construction. That was a very important part of how this story gets told. But we start with young Saoirse Ronan as Briony because it is essential that we're seeing these events first through her eyes. And they're events that, as she, and when she's 18 and played by Romola Garai later in the movie, she gives a very concise log line for how this story ultimately is interpreted. It's about a young girl who sees an event from her bedroom window, and that she doesn't understand what she's seeing, but she thinks she does. But she doesn't, ultimately. Or rather, she doesn't understand fully. And it's because she's 13 years old. And the way that her life has been set up, she is, as Cecilia later says, rather scathingly, but truthfully, I wouldn't necessarily believe everything Briony tells you. She's rather fanciful. And you know, children always can be fanciful. Like, that's part of, you know, having a more open mind when you're younger, and being, you know, imagination is one of the ways that we stretch our creative faculties and learn about the world around us. But when you think back to the idea that Briony, she's 13 years old, she is obviously part from a rich family, but we don't really see, like, that she has many friends, or even that she necessarily wants friends, or that she articulates. You know, she has an absent father who does not appear in this movie, except as like a deleted scene or a voice over the phone. She has a kind of a loving but somewhat distant mother. She has two siblings who are both adults, older, and then she has cousins who she doesn't seem to be that connected to. So what she has very much is her interior life. She could be considered as a lonely girl, but she doesn't seem that way because she is very obsessed with creating her own worlds. And, you know, whether that's to fill the void that's kind of been left behind by, like, in the absence of, you know, close family and friends near her age, but she doesn't seem to be, like, missing them outwardly. She seems to relish being able to create these stories and to delve into them and to have that sense of control. One of the things that, you know, she starts off this movie writing a play, and she's very excited, and then she wants to put the play on for her family, specifically for her brother Leon, who she seems to, you know, be very excited is coming back to see them. But she has the line where she's like, maybe I should have written him a story instead. And then she has a line that's very telling where she says, plays are dependent on other people. And there's a double line meaning in that. One, there's the simple fact that you need other people to act in plays. And she has a problem there because she enlists her cousins, her two young cousins, Jackson and Pierrot, and her cousin Lola, to act in the play, and they aren't as invested in this as she is, and they kind of scatter, and that's part of the reason the play never happens. Perhaps if it had, these events would have formed differently. But it's also that when you write a play, you can write whatever the heck you want, but then you ultimately have to trust the actors to tell that story. And they are fully capable of giving their own spin on it and their own vision. And it can be hard for somebody who is so obsessed with those details to surrender control. You know, we see a little bit of that where Lola says that she wants to play the lead role in Briony's play, The Trials of Arabella. And she kind of guilts Briony into it because of the circumstances that she and her family are going through. But then she starts trying to suggest ideas, and Briony snapped at her. If you're going to play Arabella, I'll be the director. Thank you very much. And Lola's like, sorry. But that's Briony attempting from the very beginning to assert control over the narrative. Because when she doesn't have an understanding of what's going on, the way for her to make sense of something is to put it in a story. And she, at her age, is very focused on ideas about, chivalrous knights, but also wickedness. If you kind of pay attention to the text of the play she's putting on, it's about it's about a young girl who is very enamored with this kind of distant Sir Romulus Turnbull, who she knows is not a great guy, that he's the most dangerous man in the world, but she can't help but be enamored of him anyway. And there's a sense of like unspoken danger there, but we don't get the sense of what kind of danger it is. It's clear that there are elements of danger that she finds exciting, even though she doesn't understand what real danger ultimately is. But that allows her imagination to run wild, and it does untold damage when she can't let go of those kind of ideas of fancy and control. And because one of the things that the book goes into, which I have not read the book in full in many years, but I do remember certain passages, and one of them is the idea of Briony ultimately reckoning with the fact that one of the things you struggle with is that you have your own mind, but she is debating, like, are other people all having, exactly the same thoughts and feelings that have every bit as much weight as mine do? Well, then the world's just unbearably complicated. But if they don't, then they're basically just, machines, pleasant enough on the surface, but they're kind of struggling to, I'm kind of just the center of the universe, and everyone's, kind of orbiting around me and my story. And that's kind of the way the children have to make sense of the world. But she ultimately what she's about in her journey throughout this movie. Part of it is learning to see other minds and other people having their own stories and their own value, and working that into her sense of perspective. And she ultimately learns how to do that by writing again and telling a story that will ultimately be the defining version of these events once everyone else is gone and there's no one else to remember it. But when she's a child, she has a very egocentric view of the world, and when something doesn't make sense in her world, she finds a way to make it make sense through storytelling. And as we can see, that's not just child's play. That can have very real tragic consequences.
Yeah. You mentioned before, if the play had just gone on, things might have gone differently. This is definitely one of those stories where you're just like, oh God, if any number of things had just gone a little bit differently. We wouldn't have this great tragedy. It feels like that reminds me very much of, what the experience was like reading A Game of Thrones, and like that the first chapter of that story. It's like if just one person made a different decision. Yeah. It's just so tragic because you like when you remember what it was like to be a child, and especially if you had a more fanciful imagination, you have a lot of empathy for the fact that, Briony it's not her fault, in a lot of ways. I mean, it's just unfortunate that, it's a combination of, her far-fetched imagination and the way that she views things. And again, like I was just saying, like a bad timing and the sequence of events that unfortunately just don't go right. And I just find it so sad that, watching this, that on the one side of it, you've got what Briony is processing everything and seeing such nefarious intent, in what's happening with Cecilia and Robbie. And then you get the other side of the story where it's this sort of beautiful love story that's unfolding. Um, and it's a lack of, again, bad timing, a lack of communication, and, and just an um, unfortunate events just colliding, and a very despicable Benedict Cumberbatch thrown into the mix. Which, by the way, anybody watching this hoping to see Sherlock, you don't get you don't get that.
No,
But this was an early role for him, and back when he was just like, you saw the name in the credits and you're like, what's a Benedict Cumberbean? But yeah, this was before he was the big sensation.
Yeah, and I got to be honest. The first time I watched this movie, I didn't know who Benedict Cumberbatch was. This was before he kind of exploded onto the stage with Sherlock and Doctor Strange and everything. I mean, obviously, I recognized him playing the actor, the character, but it was like he was just the character. And it was only after years later when I went back and watched this movie again after that I'd forgotten he was in the movie, or rather that he was playing a role as prominent. I was like, oh yeah, God, this is a dark role. And I mean, as a younger actor at that time in his career, like he was taking this role because like it was part of him building up his profile. And he plays the role very well, but the role is a contemptible role. He is the true, we talked about the idea that like she's talking about the Sir Romulus Turnbull being the most dangerous man in the world. Briony thinks it's Robbie. It is Paul Marshall. He is the one morally irredeemable character in this movie because he has no interest in these kind of questions of morality. He is very much about taking what he wants. In
one of the most chilling parts that can go, sort of unnoticed is when the accusation has been thrown out, and everybody thinks Robbie is the one who's, committed the horrible deed later in the movie, and everybody's sort of up in arms and just waiting, for Robbie to make his way back to the house, and Marshall is on the couch sleeping. Nothing fazed him at all. He's sleeping like a baby.
Yeah, not a single weight on his soul.
Yeah.
He is, I mean, like we're coded not to like him from the start because we think he's rather, arrogant, which he is, and that he's, full of himself and like thinks he's very important. And Cecilia like sees through it right away when she calls him out that he's like, she's like, I don't really like this guy. And her brother's like, I think he's a good egg. And she's like, you say that about everyone. He is most definitely not a good egg. He is an evil man. And it's
and that's the point where I stopped liking, I didn't really like him anyway, but when I really stopped liking Cecilia's brother too, because it's like, you are not a good judge of character.
No. And I mean, the thing about it is like, obviously actors have to play all manner of roles and they have to find a way into those characters, even if that character is, morally not like unrepentant. And I feel like Benedict Cumberbatch gives a lot of that, the Paul Marshall's character, in those small moments where we can just see the dangerous, predator that is lurking behind his eyes and his generally affluent, well-presenting complexion. But it comes out in very dark moments, particularly in the scene early on in the movie where he, goes and he first sees Lola, and just your skin, once you know what is happening there, your skin just crawls. And in particular, he has this one line that I just utterly like chills my spine and like, you know, makes my skin like writhe when he tells her, "Bite it. You have to bite it." When he's talking about the chocolate bar, but you're just like, this is a man who is a predator. And
it was, and I will say it was really chilling reading the book. I remember the first time well, I've actually only read the book once, but it was my first time experiencing the story, and you're allowed a chapter inside his head. And before he goes into the room, he's having a dream, and you know, and it's kind of like, and that slow realization of when you're like, oh, this is what this guy's about, and then the scene in the room with the children unfolds, and you were just thoroughly creeped out, and Benedict Cumberbatch does a great job of, you know, of communicating that through his performance, but it's just so it's just chilling, and then it adds like this whole new weight of, you know, of tension, and you know, you're freaked out by that moment, and then it, you know, the scene cuts to Briony out in the fields with the music again, back at it, like upping the tempo, and that's when she's writing about Sir Romulus, and but her focus is on Robbie, but we've just seen Marshall, and so he's the wolf in sheep's clothing, but she's at this point thinking that about Robbie, and it's just, yeah, it's that's why, like, as beautiful as this film is, and it's a masterful film, that it's very, the subject matter is very disquieting, and difficult to watch, and especially at this point, you know that just something bad is going to happen, and you're just waiting for the chips to fall in all the wrong place, in all the wrong places. And yeah, we're just kind of jumping all around the opening act of the movie here, but it's, you know, a big part of, well, let's backtrack a little bit and talk about Robbie and Cecilia, and you know, especially the scene at the fountain. You know, it's which it really starts off when Briony says, "See, why don't you talk to Robbie anymore?" And says, "I do. We just move in different circles. That's all." Which, by the way, boy, is there a lot of you know, class subtext throughout this movie. Just
it's a sentiment.
Yeah, and before I get to what I just said we were going to talk about, there's a red herring thrown in throughout this movie, which, speaking of, I mentioned Game of Thrones earlier. We get a young Theon Greyjoy popping up in this movie. And notice the difference between when he comes to the doorway watching the rehearsal of what the kids are doing. It's played as very awkward and like, but it's all sort of viewed through the prism of how these people who are very well off look at the servants.
Yeah.
And that they are people to be suspicious of, versus Paul Marshall, who comes in, you know, until he really drops the bomb of when we realize like what he's about. Before that, he's all cordiality and, you know, very nice guy, you know, versus Danny, who's you know, oh, what's our wonderful Theon actor's name? I'm drawing
Alfie
Alfie Allen. Yeah, he plays Danny, and and just that moment, and also just a little bit before when he's holding all the bags when Cecilia's brother and Marshall come in, and he's just waiting to either be told where to put them or maybe even a little help. and Cecilia just looks at him and, you know, and just says, you know, they go in whatever room she says. And then she gives this look to her brother that's just like, you know, so dismissive of this guy because, you know, he's an employee, you know, and, you know, and so it just, it goes to show, and even later in the film, like, he's suspect number one after, you know, if it's not Robbie, well, it had to be, you know, it had to be the servant, you know, and you know, I don't think they even consider that it would have been Marshall. And so yeah, it's, even as we're, you know, rooting for Robbie and Cecilia, like, you know, and Cecilia has, you know, we don't get to be with her in a lot of moments. She's the, like, we don't get a point of view of her, but it does seem like she does go on a bit of a character journey, and maybe, you know, and what she does. It would be interesting to get her point of view on how she views things as she separates from her family and maybe, and goes to work in the hospital and probably has a different outlook on things than she does earlier in the film.
Yeah.
But we don't get that. But yeah, so much of this movie really is, you know, you have to look at, you know, and Robbie says earlier, for all my education, you know, your family viewed me as he says, little better than a servant. And thanks to you, they were able to close ranks and throw me to the effing wolves. And it's just, yeah.
Yeah. It is. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the class distinctions are an essential part of this movie because, you know, this is an era where perhaps the separation between the classes of, you know, the aristocrats and the working class is not quite as rigid as it once was back in the days of, you know, kings and like the full, like, you know, kings and queens or regency era, you know, England that we've seen in some of the other movies. There is some porous interaction, you know, but those structures are still implicitly in place, and people still feel uncomfortable breaching them. And that's it's one of the reasons it's essential in the beginning is that is what kind of divides Robbie and Cecilia. You know, it is implied, you know, they're about the same age. It's implied, you know, they grew up together. Robbie is the housekeeper's son. And when they're your children, those distinctions really don't seem to make as much of a difference. So it's implied that Robbie and Cecilia knew each other very well and, you know, played together as children. And then they went to university together. And it's stated that Cecilia and Briony's and Leon's father paid for Robbie's education at Cambridge. And, you know, he probably did that as an act of charity, you know, as a, like, you know, it's like, this is my daughter's friend, the daughter of my char lady, like, you know, I'll send him off to college. And, you know, it was a generous act, but it was not really done out of compassion in that same way, in the sense that, like, Robbie received that beneficiary, but he never got this, like, essentially the welcoming into the family that such a thing might have implied, you know. And yeah, it's noted early on that even though Cecilia and Robbie went to university together, they kind of, Leon notes, like, she barely said a word to him in 3 years there. And you're like, well, that's kind of odd. Like, if they knew each other growing up, why wouldn't she talk to him? And there are a couple different reasons for that. And one of them is that, you know, once they're outside the confines of their, you know, the house where they grew up, it probably wasn't considered as socially acceptable for her to, socialize with someone like Robbie. But there was still a connection there, a very clear connection. And part of the reason it's implied that she was also avoiding him is she was working through the feelings that she had for him, but she didn't feel comfortable expressing it.
Well, here's the thing about all that, which has made my mind race back and forth, for years about this story, is the fact that so much of this is Briony's interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And what we get with Robbie and Cecilia is this, beautiful star-crossed lovers, story. And so it's left open to interpretation exactly what transpired when they were away at college. Briony paints the library encounter as like their first, moment together, but it's open to interpretation if maybe something did go on between them in college, and what we're seeing is Briony's sort of fairy tale version of fairy tale up to a certain point anyway. To paint this image of the, but that's just like, if you go down that road, it's can drive you insane, because it's like, what do we, how much of the story as we're presented do we believe? And it's, but it is interesting to think, what can we infer from, what Briony wants us to glean from the story, and what are the elements which are more open to interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, even for a movie like this, where it is very definitively established that we have an unreliable narrator and multiple perspectives, and events are not always unfolding exactly as we anticipate, at a certain point, you have to take things that are established in the movie at face value. Otherwise, you're just going to spiral. And the way I kind of reconcile that is at the end, when Briony is admitting that she, this is a part of a story that she is telling based on her real life. She does note that I got firsthand accounts of all the events that I did not personally witness. And I kind of use that as a license to say that, generally speaking, even if we're not privy to all of the intimate character moments between characters like Robbie and Cecilia, particularly Robbie and Cecilia, because they are being held up by Briony as kind of, the tragic heroes of our story, and she does kind of want to idealize them a little bit, as part of her act of atonement. I do think that we're not missing some absolutely critical event. I kind of interpret it as the idea that, like, when Robbie and Cecilia confessed their undying love for each other, they had not done something like that previously. They may have had a moment beforehand where there was clear attraction and tension between them, but they probably didn't talk about it then. And that might be one of the reasons why there seems to be an awkward dynamic between them at the start, because there are the barriers of class differences. Robbie, like, clearly he feels comfortable talking to Cecilia in certain respects, but he also freely admits that he feels lightheaded and foolish around her. And at some points he does overstep his bounds, and they kind of get into it. Like in that conversation that when they're walking to the fountain, they talk about the fact that, Robbie is like now thinking about going off to study even more to be a doctor. And Cecilia's like, another 6 years of education, and Paul, and like, why would you do that? Why are you like thinking about leaving again? And Robbie was basically thinks she's talking about like, my father already paid for your education, now you want more? And he's like, I told my father I would pay him back. And she kind of looks back at him and she looks hurt and she says, that's not what I meant at all. And it's because in part she doesn't feel like, as she's wrestling with her feelings for him, she is, what she's actually struggling with there is the idea about him leaving her again before she's had a chance to figure it out. There are a ton of deleted scenes from this movie, and I've watched them, and the ones that were deleted, they very much were deleted for a reason. I don't really think the movie misses them, but there is a notable scene where Cecilia is talking to her brother Leon, and he alludes to the fact that, why aren't you in London? And basically she came back to the house because she says that she was searching for something. And she's like, whatever it was, I haven't found it here. Well, my understanding was she probably came back because whether she would acknowledge it to herself or not, she was searching for Robbie. And I kind of feel like that is an unspoken dynamic where, because these two are of different classes and because there's, social barriers and financial, discrepancies and things along those lines, Robbie and Cecilia just can't talk to each other directly. And, you've mentioned like the way of things, going wrong. And the biggest one, or one of the biggest ones in this chain of AIR, is the idea that Robbie doesn't feel he can go and just apologize to Cecilia in person when they have their argument. He feels the need to write her a letter. And that is,
Yeah, and before we talk about all that, I will just say that, and I don't necessarily think that we're meant to, like, second guess, like, in great detail, like what Briony describes. Maybe she got some details wrong here and there, but I don't think we're supposed to doubt her image. But I do think, like, the very concept of the way the story is constructed, it opens that up as a conversation. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. It's easy, at the end of the day, I don't want to dwell on that kind of thing too much, because it's like, well, then we just doubt the entire story, and and that doesn't help anybody. So like with the movie Black Swan, there are people who, like, have so many wild interpretations just because, like, they view Natalie Portman's character as, like, sort of her perspective is unreliable, and they take it to such an extreme that I'm like, well, then why even bother watching the movie if I can't trust anything I'm saying? So yeah, at that point, I'm just trying to, like, no. It's the story is what the story is.
Yeah, and that actually is a very interesting idea, because this movie very much deals with, as Briony said, it's based on the real events of her life. But where the unreliable nature comes into it is ideas of perspective and memory, and not being able to truly know another person's thoughts, as opposed to a movie like Black Swan, where the idea is we can't trust our narrator because our narrator is losing their mind. So are these events actually happening or not? That can be a little bit more frustrating for an audience, because you get invested in something and then they realize, oh, that actually didn't happen, and it can still be thematically valuable. But the idea is that we're seeing these events and they did happen, they just may not have meant or proceeded exactly as they were presented. And the most telling example of that, or the first example of that, I should say, is the fact that, as we mentioned, Briony sees Robbie and Cecilia arguing by the fountain from her bedroom window, and she sees Robbie yell at Cecilia, and then she sees Cecilia jump into strip off her clothes and jump into the fountain, and then they kind of are staring at each other awkwardly, and she interprets that in a very malicious way. But then we cut back later in the movie, and at first it seems like, oh, we're catching up with Robbie and Cecilia now later in the event, and then you quickly realize, no, the movie is going to show us that exact scene again, and this time it's going to show us what's happening from Robbie and Cecilia's perspective. And the assumption that we kind of have to take with the movie is that this perspective of Robbie and Cecilia's perspective is probably closer to the truth than what Briony initially thought it was, even if for instance, she may not have known exactly what was said between the two because, you know, she said she got firsthand accounts of everything she didn't witness. She can't get a firsthand account of that conversation because Robbie and Cecilia were the only parties to it. And unfortunately, by the end, they were not able to tell their own story anymore. But when we see Robbie and Cecilia have that conversation by the fountain, and we see that Robbie shouts at Cecilia because he's concerned that she's about to step on a sharp piece of broken vase and hurt herself. And then Cecilia jumps into the fountain to retrieve that broken piece of vase, not because Robbie told her to, but entirely of her own volition as a way to kind of like needle him a little bit. And then when she steps out of the fountain and they look at each other, it's a moment of Cecilia's realizing, what did I just do? Now I'm standing here in my shift, you know, that's kind of see-through because of the water, and Robbie's looking at me, and Robbie's looking at her, you know, like, I can't believe she just did that. And the sexual tension between them is just crackling. And then they just walk away.
And a classic cinematic moment was born.
Yeah.
Yeah, stay focused on the story, John. But yeah, it's just the conflicting viewpoints of that. And I will say that my memory of that is because I knew ahead of time what the movie was doing in terms of flashing back. So I remember I had to explain to my mom that that's what was happening, because it doesn't like spell it out for you. You kind of, once you start to see, you know, that event, you know, from being in the first person perspective, then, you know, then you catch on to the fact that, oh, okay, we're seeing what, you know, what happened before. But I'll say this as nicely as I can about my mom, but sometimes watching movies, she was a little slow on the uptake on some things. So I do remember that I had to explain what was going on there, because I think she was a little bit of like, didn't we already see this? And oh boy, and I could tell stories about when I had her watch Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. It involved pressing pause a lot and breaking things down. But that's a discussion for another time. So, but yeah, it's yeah, and that is the big thing. And again, like just talking about the music, though, I love when, you know, before we get to this version of the sequence where it shows like, you know, Briony is like, you know, shutting the window, and then, you know, the piano starts up and it cuts to Cecilia, you know, running. And yeah, it's just, this movie is so beautifully constructed.
Yeah.
And but yeah, like, and to put it, you know, plainly, you know, that moment when Cecilia comes out of the water, that just like really starts this like intense, you know, sort of heart racing sexual tension that, you know, continues on and until the library scene, and it's just so amazingly well done. And you feel what these characters are feeling, and again, repeating myself, a lot of that is what the music is doing. It's so yeah, it's just wonderful. But then comes the apology letter, which in, you know, the annals of big screw ups, this might be one of the biggest ones.
It's a pretty big one, and you know, and it's there. The tragedy, of course, is that like that letter was never meant to be read, and he very much just wrote it as a release of his emotions to in order to get what he actually was trying to say in the more formal ways. But of course, it's the real answer is a mixture between the two, because he is madly in love with her, and he, but at this stage he doesn't necessarily, again, feel like he can communicate to her directly, and he would never do it in such a vulgar way as
I was
he
going to
does
say,
in the letter
he would never do it that directly.
in her face. But like, the reason he's struggling in the beginning is because he's trying to write very formally, and he's like, "Dearest Cecilia, I would like to extend my most sincere apologies for the way I acted," and that's not what he's actually feeling. And then he writes the more vulgar version just to kind of like clear his head. You can see him like laugh and like, okay, now that I got that out of my system, now I can actually find what I need to write. And then he writes her a very heartfelt, letter where he basically says that, like, truth is, I feel lightheaded and foolish around you, and I don't think I can blame the heat, which it's, but
which I love, because it is a very like silly, clumsy way of basically within the time period this takes place of saying, "I've really got the hots for you. I'd love it if."
Well, I mean, it is a deliberate choice on the part of both the original author Ian McEwan and the movie itself. This day is very poignantly, quote, the hottest day of the year. And you're like, that's subtle, that's nice. But, and of course, the heat is due to the fact of the unspoken passion. But, oh yeah, and this is fantastic. Part of it is that when Cecilia ultimately reads the letter, she's a bit scandalized by it, but she's also excited by it. And like, when they finally reunite and like he tries to apologize for it, she's not like, I can't believe you said that to me. His letter, weirdly, actually set her free, because what she had been struggling with was like, I'm madly in love with this guy. I can't, I can't.
Her attitude at the door is totally like, hey, I'd like it explained to me exactly what you were thinking, but then but follow me, because we're gonna bone now.
In a weird way, that him inadvertently giving her that letter gives her the sense of power she needed to be free with her own feelings, because she was clearly struggling to express those feelings herself. But once she knows with irreversible certainty just how like head over heels Robbie is for her, in very anatomical terms, as she said, she knows like, oh, I have all the power here. And that look that in that scene right there is very much like, yes, I know what you did. I know that was not entirely proper, but guess what? I'm into you too. And so now you're going to do what I want you to do. And throughout that entire scene, she is just exuding like confidence right up until the moment when it turns into very raw and honest emotional vulnerability, because ultimately what she actually wants is to pour her heart out to him. And when that time comes, then she becomes less confident again, because she, even if you know for certain like that the other person is interested in you, like, it's another thing to actually admit that to them yourself and like pour your heart out in that way. And she ultimately like stumbles over her words when she, when he asks her like, why are you crying? And she just looks at him and she says, don't you know? She knows that he knows, but it's like, it's very much just words are failing her at this moment, just as they kind of failed him before. And but it doesn't matter in this stage, because in this stage, they have now arrived on equal terms, and they know without speaking just how deeply they feel for one another. And they just are seeking that sense of permission to, finally express it fully. And then finally they are able to. And results in one of the most tender and beautiful love scenes you will ever see. And of course, that's part of the tragic irony of it, because we know that this encounter is entirely consensual. It is one of the most, honest and, desired pairings of love and sex that you will ever see. And of course, that means it gets misinterpreted to tragic consequences.
Yeah, oh God, it's the one, like I said before, like I have complete sympathy for Briony, and she is as much of a victim in this story as anybody else. But this is the one scene where I'm like, God damn it, Briony, really bad time. Yeah, but I do want to talk about the fact that this is, I think this has to, and I'm going to try and like sound objective about this because, obviously, it's Keira Knightley. So, but, but I think that it's the way this film is so beautifully constructed and the way it builds up to this moment. It is one of the most beautiful, intoxicating love scenes in cinema, just because of what leads up to it, and it just it just really warms my heart when you get to that moment where, because everything about this moment between them is so perfect. The way, um, when she says, "Don't you know?" and he says, "Yes, I know exactly," and he goes in for that kiss, but then he stops and he waits for her to, say yes. It's okay. And the way when they're in the heat of the moment, and they just stop for a moment, and she says, "Robbie," and then he says, "Cecilia," and she says, "I love you." And then the way he responds, "I love you." It's not like, I think it's described this way in the book, where it's not like his "I love you" is not like a response, but it's as if like they're both saying it as if they're the first as if like he's saying it as though he said it before she did. And it's such a authentic, beautiful, um, you know, uh, declaration of love from both of them. And it is just, every time I watch it, it's one of those scenes where you just don't breathe while you're watching it, and your heart's pounding like a thousand times a minute. It is just so beautiful, and which just makes it so much more tragic. Just when Briony comes into the room, and this again, it's like bad decisions made building up when neither one of them takes a moment to talk to her, you know, um, which, from their perspective, they don't know that tragedy is going to unfold from that decision. But if, they, because of the awkwardness of that moment, they just, push past her. But if at least one of them had, you know, stopped to actually communicate with her about, what just transpired, then things would have been different. But like I said before, that's true of 1,000 things that go wrong in this film.
Yeah, and the tragedy is that Briony has been worked into this almost against her will, but because this part of this all kicks, I mean, like, yes, she sees them by the window and she has that fanciful interpretation. And as we learn later in the movie, she at one point harbored a very, girlish crush on Robbie herself, to the point that she was, wanted to kind of express that to him in a different way. But, this all kicks up into terrible gear when Robbie, almost in like an casual, amusing, like lighthearted way, asks Briony to deliver the letter herself, and like not realizing, and of course until she's run off with it, that it's the wrong letter. But
that is like the most panicked scream ever. Is Briony? Yeah, it's
But it's like, I mean, I'm sure, and as he said, he's like, I felt rather foolish like giving it to her myself, and it's like, you know, if he would just gotten over that, this entire tragedy might not have happened. But you know, and the fact that Bryony reads the letter, of course she's going to read the letter. Like they know what the kind of girl she is, and like, you know, it's in the sense that like she is constantly searching for inspiration in her writing, and like this is a very private piece of correspondence that is, you know, meant to be shared between two people, and so it's of great value to a writer. And of course Robbie doesn't realize that. And then when Cecilia gets the letter, like she now knows that Bryony has read it because it's open, but she doesn't talk to her about it in that moment. She just kind of like hides it away because she's now processing her own feelings. And then, as you alluded to, the fact that Bryony, who's kind of in an emotionally rough place at the moment because of everything that's going on with her own family, and the fact that she, you know, her play fell apart, and she's now dealing with these fears that she has about Robbie that she's kind of built up in her mind. And then she walks in, and they're in the Robbie and Cecilia are in the middle of their sexual act, their entirely consensual sexual act, and they can see that Bryony's upset, and they don't even take a moment to comfort her. Would that have been enough to reassure her? It may have been, but they don't even speak a word to her. They just walk right past her. And like that
and again, and that's why it's bad circumstances and lack of communication, but they also don't know that she observed them earlier and misunderstood, you know, what was going on at the fountain. So it's just, it's just the thing about stories. We have that outside vantage point, and we can see what everybody's doing wrong, but they don't know.
And the thing is, like, no, we are keyed into it, especially because of the tragedy. But of course, you know, in the moment, Robbie and Cecilia, like, they are probably feeling very ashamed that they got caught in the act, and they're thinking about themselves. They're thinking about what they've just discovered with each other and how to preserve it. And so their focus is not on the traumatized little girl who just walked in on them. Their focus is like, okay, we got to get out, extract ourselves from this situation. And if that shame is a very natural and understandable response, but decisions made out of shame are very, very rarely going to be the most emotionally clear-headed decisions. And the kind thing to do in that moment would have been not even just like the right thing or the smart thing, just the kind thing might have been to try and reassure Brian in that moment, because clearly she was very upset. And the fact that she has no one to talk to about this just leaves her, you know, the opportunity. She has to, again, make sense of it in the story.
Yeah. I do want to say that, you know, talking some more about the parallels between this and Pride and Prejudice. I was just thinking about, we see, you know, when they go out to the dinner table, there's, you know, their hands under the table. I love the way they're just like intertwining their fingers and just, you know, they just have to, you know, be touching each other. It's so beautiful. And then of course earlier we get the moment with Robbie's hand, and then he puts it down to the water. You're definitely recalling the Darcy hand flex and connecting the movies. So I love that. Before we get into the next part, I want to pause right here because we are an hour and a half in, so I'm going to do the mid-roll real quick. Thank you, those of you who have joined us for the stream. And I appreciate it. It's nice to see you guys here. And next week, we're going to be doing something that that I kind of always knew was going to happen, but I'm excited that we're going to start doing it. It's a special edition of the stream that we're going to start, sort of informally calling, the Revisited streams, where because Jared has not been, my co-host for the whole history of this channel, but there's a lot of movies that both of us want to talk about that maybe I already talked about. And besides, I have favorite movies that maybe I'd like to go ahead and revisit and talk some more about. And so next week, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be tackling Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth, which I did talk about previously on the channel, but it's a favorite movie of Jared's as well as mine. And so we're going to have a great time talking about that next week. I recall that my experience seeing that movie in theaters was, I remember saying at the time that it was probably the most thrilling fantasy experience I had in the cinema since Fellowship of the Ring. It's a very different kind of movie, but just in terms of it being like a very dark fairy tale, and I was thrilled by the beauty of the film and the artistry, and yeah, I can always talk about that movie, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we're going to be able to discuss it, because as you alluded to, you had already discussed it on the channel. It was a great conversation, and I didn't feel necessarily like it was my place to, once I agreed to come on as your co-host, to be like, and here are all the movies that I want to talk about, even if you've already talked about them. So I'm just like, John already talked about Pan's Labyrinth. It was a good conversation. We'll find other topics. But I was a little bit, sad that I hadn't gotten the chance to talk about it with you, just because Pan's Labyrinth is not just like, one of my favorite movies, like top 15, top 25, whatever. Pan's Labyrinth might be my favorite movie. If you set aside the fact that like I have deep abiding love for things like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, and collectively, like the three Lord of the Rings films are probably my favorite movie, but I have such a hard time picking between them. And then like the cumulative experience of all the Star Wars movies, I love them so much. But, I would probably say Empire Strikes Back would be my favorite of them. But I always felt a little bit weird just picking one of those as like my favorite movie. And it just emerged very authentically to me that Pan's Labyrinth is a movie that I just adore, because it is a movie that is a fantasy deals with very dark, very real human themes in a very tragic and fascinating way. The filmmaking craft on it is immaculate, and the more I think about it and like what it has to say about storytelling and the human experience, I just found myself revisiting it again and again and again, and over time, I think this is the movie that has probably been the most rich experience for me, like apart from just the larger love I have of, a greater story like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. And so I feel comfortable calling it one of, if not my favorite movie. And I saw it at a very interesting place where you would not necessarily have expected one to encounter one of your favorite movies of all time. We'll talk about that next week, but I did not see it in the theater, so I found it in a different way. And the fact that it's become such a meaningful and important movie to me, and along the way, is part of the journey of that. So I would say that it's just monumental cinematic achievement. And if we're going to do this revisited series, I have a hard time thinking of a better way to kick it off. Obviously, we've had movies on the channel that you've talked about, like you've done Pirates of the Caribbean a couple times. We did a 20th anniversary celebration of that, and Lord of the Rings. But this being the start of an official like revisited type series, I would have picked this one to start it off. So
and really, it is just like I said, it's just an excuse for me to keep talking about my favorite movies. Like I do feel like I'm due to do another discussion of Blade Runner 2049. So we'll be definitely doing that in the future. And we already said we're going to do Pride and Prejudice again, but we'll set it up a little bit differently with some discussions leading up to that, maybe with the 1995 miniseries version. But yeah, so lots of fun stuff to dive into, and it's great that we're going to start off with this one because I just thought of another reason why it's put me in the sort of Lord of the Rings frame of mind when the film came out, because I think the movie was actually released theatrically and on home video through New Line Cinema. And at the time they were still in business and not just a subsidiary of Warner Brothers, which they really only exist in name these days, which is sad because I have a lot of fond memories of New Line. But yeah, and we'll talk about all that when we do that discussion. And then the week after that, we'll be celebrating your birthday, and we'll be talking about the first film in the what's known as the Before trilogy, called Before Sunrise. And then I still have I've never seen the film before, and I haven't watched it as of yet, but it'll be getting to that, and if all goes well, we'll be tackling the other two films in the trilogy as well, and then after that, the week following that, we'll be doing our final Bad Batch stream of the season, tackling the last couple episodes, including what is hopefully a extended finale.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm couldn't be happier with what we have coming up. Where with Pan's Labyrinth, and then before sunrise, before sunset, before midnight. I've talked about it before that like that trilogy of movies. That's another one where I have a hard time picking a favorite between the three because they're all such beautiful movies and they're very unique movies. Very like kind of in the moment conversational pieces that deal with time and love and memory in a very specific way that I just find incredibly rewarding to revisit. So I'm very, very glad that you're willing to take the leap and watch at least the first one as my birthday gift. But hopefully we'll have a good conversation about it. And if we get a chance to talk about the other two, I would love that as well. But I'm only making you commit to the first one. But I hope if you haven't seen it in the chat that you'll join us for that, because it's a movie that I sometimes hesitate to recommend to people because it is kind of a different movie that, it's really just two characters having a conversation. And if you aren't going to be on that wavelength, then you might not get the same value out of it that others do. But if you can get on its wavelength, I just find it immensely rewarding. So I hope you give it that chance. And then the Bad Batch will just, you've heard us talk about the Bad Batch. We love that show. It's going to be the series finale. We're going to go all out on that one.
It's so funny. We've been going on about how dark the show has been, and then I got hit with this past week's episode of X-Men 97, which I won't talk about in detail, but let's just say that I'm still struggling with my feelings on that one. Some shit went down that I'm not didn't have me in a very good mood. Let's just say that the Bad Batch, this dark last stretch of episodes from the Bad Batch is now my pick-me-up show. So yeah, looking forward to talking about all of that. Anything else before we dive back in?
No, it's a lot of fun stuff coming up in the next few weeks, and if with Atonement and Pan's Labyrinth being very dark movies, one thing I will say about Before Sunrise is it's definitely got some elements of sadness and tragedy to it, but it is not a movie that makes you want to just spiral into despair, even if it's a beautiful movie. It ends on it's a very hopeful movie, even and so it'll be a nice palate cleanser in that way, hopefully.
Good, yeah, because I wasn't even focused on the fact that we had back-to-back darkness with Atonement and Pan's Labyrinth, but you're right. Pan's Labyrinth is not a happy-go-lucky movie either. So yay, uplifting.
Yeah.
So let's dive back into Atonement. We're approaching a good point where I think it's good to step back and have a little bit of a conversation about, we're at the point where, they go, the twins have run away. They don't have very far to go, but but they ran away into the night, and everybody goes out in search of them, and Briony goes out in search, by herself, and then tragically, among the different search parties, Robbie also goes out by himself, which is another, unfortunate mistake on his part. And what she witnesses is a horrible act, which is, put it as lightly as I can, an attack on Lola. And from our perspective, we don't see her discover a face, and that's kind of ambiguous as to exactly how much she sees. I think later in the film, when a face is revealed, I think that's as much of like, with the knowledge that she gains at that point, her filling in the blanks. It's still left ambiguous as to what exactly she sees in this moment. But she accuses Robbie, having been certain, of what she's interpreted as his behavior thus far, throughout the film, and she convinces Lola, saying, she's like, it was Robbie, wasn't it? And Lola, who is understandably frightened to point the finger at Marshall, is, but even her, I think it takes a moment for, like, she's not sure how to respond, and it's just Briony is so certain that I think Lola, then feels like, that she's just going to go along with that accusation, and so this is a good point to, as I said, step back and have a conversation about. This film came out in 2007, a very different time. We weren't having the conversations we're having now. What are your feelings on it? Because I definitely, I hate to think of the conversations that would be had by certain groups of people if this film came out today as it is. And yet I don't think that the film itself is doing anything wrong. It's telling a very specific story. But it is questionable as to whether it would be made today. What are your feelings on that?
So they're complicated, but there are different ways to frame it, and so probably just to set the broadest possible stage and to provide a slight warning to anyone who may be watching who doesn't know exactly what we're about to talk about, just to give you a moment to step aside for a few minutes. We'll return to it, discussion of the rest of the movie later. It is an unavoidable fact that the tragic events at the center of this movie deal with an incident of sexual violence. And we, as a society, are attempting to find our way to talk about these things in a way that makes everyone feel heard and makes everyone feel not comfortable, but like they are being represented and that it's safe and that these things are, we're going to get to a point where these events can be, if they're going to be depicted on screen, depicted in a way that represents the true horror of them and deals with the fallout in an appropriate manner. And for some people are currently in a place where they are just like, these events should never be depicted on screen at all. I am not there. Now, I say this as a cisgender, heterosexual, white male from a place of privilege on that front, but just in a larger sense that I don't believe in that not depicting horrific events is the way to handle them. I believe it should be a matter of personal choice of whether or not you want to engage with that kind of storytelling. And if you do choose to present that kind of storytelling, you have to be absolutely certain that you're capable of handling it. And if you're going to be writing it or depicting it, you have to do it in the way where you're being respectful of all the sensitivities surrounding it. And that is an incredibly hard thing to do. And so for some people, that might be easier just to not do it at all. And for us to not to talk about it at all, frankly. This is one of the reasons that we were hoping to have somebody else on our on this discussion, was we wanted another perspective, But, it's just going to be us, and we're going to try to do this subject matter justice. And one of the reasons that I think that it's okay for us to, discuss the events of this movie is because there is a larger conversation around it. But what this movie deals with is actually an element of the fallout that I find a little bit more on something that anyone who's engaged in movie storytelling should be able to process with. Because when people talk about movies like this, everyone comes to it from different experiences, and what everyone is going to be looking at is this movie, treating these events with the gravity and respect that such subject matter deserves. And I feel this movie does. And I feel it's our duty to, try to meet it at that level. Because for this instance, one of the things that this movie does that allows it to kind of play with this subject matter is it treats the act itself exactly as it can and should be depicted, as an act of absolute horror. It is an act where there is not any kind of equivocating about this event being depicted as like, is there any moral gray area here? No, the attacker, the rapist, Paul Marshall, is committing an evil act here. And he's committing a violent assault on an underage girl in Lola. That is horrific and unforgivable, and the movie treats it as such. It also gets into a larger conversation about the nature of how you deal with the aftermath of that. And that is an area where I think this movie one, it's, there's incredibly rich thematic subtext to dig into there, but there's also just the simple fact that I'm probably the most uncomfortable with about this movie, great as it is, as much as I love it, which is the fact that the victim herself, Lola, is not the center of the story. The story is about Briony and her perception of this event, because she is not the victim. It is about the fallout of what happens to Cecilia and Robbie because of the event itself. And they become victims of that, even though they're not the victims of the act itself. But Lola herself, it is just an unavoidable truth about this movie. She is not the center of this story. And that makes it complicated to talk about from my perspective, because we see her dealing with the devastating fallout of it, but the movie does not, center her perspective. She's in shock, obviously. And that's not the story this movie is telling, but it's just something that needs to be said. And
that's also, yeah, and also that's, if you look at, it's complicated to talk about that, because that's not what Brian is consumed with, what she did wrong, and the fallout of that, and so it's a question of, but does any movie dealing with this, should the focus be on the victim of the act, rather than, victims, other victims arising from the fallout of all that. So yeah, that is a tricky area. I do want to ask you about one thing that I know I have heard is people, some people coming to this movie in sort of the modern age, also, like, it's inescapable that this movie also deals with a false accusation.
Yeah, and that is actually the area that I find more detailed to talk about. I just wanted to get that on the record, because it's a simple fact that Lola is not the main character of the story, and the attack happens to her. And I just want to be cognizant of the fact that we're ultimately going to shift our focus to talking about what Briony thinks she saw and what she says she saw, and how that's not the truth, and the devastating effect that it has on multiple people's lives. And that is very real and very devastating within the movie itself. And it's something that's another aspect of the real world consequences around these things that's difficult to talk about. But what I didn't want to do was not talk about the fact that the actual victim of the sexual assault in this scene is an underage.
It is very important to talk about, because even when Lola comes back into the story, the revelation about, even though we as the audience strongly, certainly, we know it's Marshall, just based on, the scenes we get with him and Lola early in the film, but the other characters don't. And so when that revelation comes later in the film, where Briony realizes that it was Marshall, like, her coming back into the story serves as a revelation, but the effect is what it means for her, Robbie, and Cecilia. So I can definitely see where people could take issue with that. I mean, that she exists, and what happens to her, like, is important only in so much as it then creates another plot point for our quote unquote main characters. And so Yeah, I'm conflicted on how I feel about that because, you know, we have our main characters in the story, but if you're looking at it from a sort of more objective viewpoint of, um, it's definitely an area where I definitely can understand criticisms.
Yeah, and I think that the reason, I mean, one of the many reasons that I wanted that just put out there is because I remember when here I was hearing conversations about this movie, hearing about the nature of the perspective and the ultimately false accusation that Briony makes against Robbie. Um, I just don't remember as much conversation about exact what happens to Lola, and that is
No, you're
that I
right.
that I think is where we have mercifully come further as a society. And I do want to just lay that groundwork in order to say that ultimately that is not the focus of this movie. And if that is a deal breaker for you, then I understand that. I think the movie still has immense artistic value aside from that, and that is an essential part of the story. But the fact that Briony and Cecilia and Robbie are our main protagonists are, means that ultimately the focus of the story is going to shift back to them and how these events affect them. And they are inextricably tied up into it because unfortunately, and this is where I really think that we can kind of bridge the conversation, Briony inserts herself into this story. And one of the things that I found the most kind of upsetting on this watch, as well as recent rewatches that I've done, is that when Briony finds Lola in the aftermath of Paul Marshall's attack, not having had a clear look at his face, although it's later implied that she did actually see him and just is kind of conflating things in her mind, her concern for Lola in that moment is real, but it's also Lola kind of becomes secondary to it because Briony is understandably very concerned about wanting to know about who did this. But Lola's clearly in shock. She's very upset. She needs assistance. She was just brutally attacked. And then Briony does perhaps the single gravest mistake that Briony makes in this entire movie, even more than like some of the other stuff that she does later, is she does the one thing that you absolutely never should do when you're confronting someone who suffered a trauma like this. She inserts her perspective. When she,
Yeah.
and she essentially, gross as it is to say, she plants the idea in Lola's head because when she says, "Did you see who did this to you?" and Lola says, "No," Briony says the absolutely fatal words. "It was Robbie, wasn't it? It was Robbie." And Lola, in her traumatized state, does not have the bandwidth to comprehend something like that. So she just kind of nods and says yes. And then Briony gets her self-fulfilling confirmation that, oh, yes, it was Robbie. Lola said so. That is entirely on her. And it is a mistake that has devastating consequences because she just commits to it. And that is one of the sins that she really has to reckon with as she gains the perspective of age and what she did. But it just needs to be said, like, if you are ever unfortunate enough to encounter someone in that kind of situation, you never do that, primarily for the victim's sake, but also like legally. And it's just an absolute morass to get yourself into. And I would say that the legal system in this movie utterly and completely fails for so many reasons. But this was the one thing that, like, you can't do that. Not saying you can't do that as a movie, that's the story, but like that is one of the things that gets that this is the point of no return for Brian.
So, following up on what I was saying before, what are your feelings on? Because, like I said, we were having different conversations at the time when this movie comes out, and this is a story of, an accusation being, thrown towards a man that is ultimately false, and that's going to be to put it mildly, interpreted different to today than it was back then. And I've definitely talked to, a person or two who have felt uncomfortable with that. And so how much of that do you lay at the feet of the movie versus kind of, it's, it's just a reality of the sort of the world we find ourselves in, and do you think I'm trying to put a good way to phrase this, it's because this is clearly an individual story telling, you know, uh, it is not saying that this, it is not claiming that all accusations are false or anything like that. But I think we can easily see how, if, especially if this movie came out today, there would be a number of issues with it. How do you feel about that?
Again, complicated because, again, speaking here as two cisgender heterosexual white males about this very difficult, dark subject matter, I am cognizant of the fact that our perspective is not the definitive perspective, but I also, all due respect to anyone who feels differently, I don't feel that is like, well, then you shouldn't just be talking about it at all. If we don't talk about these things, then we never learn, and then things never get better. We just have to own our own perspective. And I feel like, it is also in the larger social politics. The novel that this movie was based on was written by a man, Ian McEwan. The screenwriter was a man, Christopher Hampton. The director was a man, Joe Wright. A woman may have told this story differently. She almost certainly would have. She may have chosen to extend different sensitivities towards this scene in particular and this subject matter. But this movie does exist. It exists in the form as written. It was, very widely seen and discussed and acclaimed by people of all genders and perspectives. And part of that is the simple fact that the movie itself, art itself, it's meant there to be put out there for discussion and to provide, enrichment to your life in some way. And if this is the kind of story you don't find enriching, then that's entirely fair. It doesn't mean it's not the type of story that shouldn't be told at all. It's just that if you're going to tell this kind of story, you need to be open to people criticizing it from different perspectives and not to get up in arms about that. To open your ears and open your heart and listen when they offer that. And I personally think that from my perspective, I have a lot of thoughts about the idea of like really how this movie centers on the idea of a false accusation and the idea that, we in our culture are very rightly in a place where we're thinking about like when women come forward with these claims of being assaulted, you need to listen to them. You need to like believe them when they say that this happened to them and, listen to what they have to say. This movie, and take them seriously and then do your due diligence and investigate. And this movie depicts a failure on that front on multiple levels. But in part because the legal system, as deeply flawed, as imperfect as it is set up to try to protect people from these things from all angles, because it is also the truth that like false accusations are, can destroy a person's life. So what we ultimately want when we're investigating situations like this is for people to take them seriously. And where this movie depicts events that go wrong is the fact that Lola herself never makes the direct accusation against Robbie. Briony does. Briony, who is not the victim, Briony, who is a witness, a very unreliable witness, assumes she knows what happened, takes her assumption as a certainty, says, I know it was him. And then the policeman says, you know it was him or I saw him? And then she revises and is like, no, I saw him. You know, she's wrong. She just is. And like, it's a very real consequence that unfolds there. And the tragedy builds because ultimately people take her word as fact. And it's, as Eric said, in this case, no one doubts that the crime happened. The movie itself does not doubt
Yes.
it. Lola absolutely was assaulted. There was a real attacker. But who that attacker was is wrong. And where this movie kind of gets into that dark area is ultimately it becomes about the fact that Briony is wrong about who the attacker was. And so she makes an accusation with the force of certainty that, as Robbie later says, allows the upper crust to close ranks and kind of protect their own and find an easy target for their rage. And the evidence against him is purely circumstantial. This is, of course, before the days of DNA evidence. If they had that kind of thing, like, obviously it's incredibly fallible in its own right, but there is no physical evidence against Robbie because he wasn't there. He was not the attacker. Briony's testimony is what convicts him. And it is just like, and that's the idea that when we say, like, we want to believe, women when they say they were attacked and like hear their stories, we don't hear Lola's story. We hear Briony's story. And that is where this movie delves into an entirely separate conversation, because Lola never gets to tell her story. Briony seizes control.
Which then you almost wonder if, because we talked about, should this movie, give more of Lola's perspective, but then perhaps the very point is that she doesn't. Yeah. And that, as you said, Briony inserts herself, into the story, and it's just like she does with her written stories, where where she's the center of the universe, and yeah, it's God, it's just, again, said it a million times, but the story is tragic on so many levels.
Yeah, it's very tragic. It's very upsetting, and it's the part of the movie that is probably the hardest to reckon with for almost anyone who's going to be watching it. And of course, that is what provides the dramatic heft for the rest of the story, because it is, if we diverge the separate path, like, we unfortunately know that Lola goes on to lead her life and she eventually marries her attacker. We don't know whether or not she ever knew it was him, or if she suspected or not. We don't get that perspective. That's not the story the movie is telling. If you want to see that as a flaw with the movie, I completely understand. Ultimately, what this movie chooses to reckon with more about is the fact that Briony chose to insert herself as the protagonist.
And the thing is, a very important element of the story is that this is not an objective, overarching view of events. This is from Briony's. I mean, the entire story really is from Briony's perspective, and that's sort of inherent to the structure of the film. So but it's completely fair if you take issue with that, then but it is what it is.
Yeah, and what I do want to just kind of back up and say is that, like, there's a larger conversation about this movie as a whole and, like, the kind of story it's telling and whether or not it should be told. Again, I personally feel that, art, I'm not for placing limits on that kind of art, but I just want it to be reckoned with respectfully if you are going to cover that subject matter. And I think what this movie does reckon with incredibly thoughtfully is Briony's perspective on realizing just what a terrible thing she did by making the story about her and seizing control of the narrative in that way. She says herself later in the movie that she was too much of a coward to go and talk to, you know, certain characters like Cecilia later, and that while she attends Lola and Paul Marshall's wedding, she doesn't confront them. She holds her silence during their wedding scene. And that is something where, you know, it's just the fact that it's an understandable human response that she is feeling this tremendous weight of guilt and shame on that front. And that is dramatically interesting. And that is really what the movie reckons with. And the fact that if we keep it to the movie itself and not have a larger conversation about what kind of story the movie is telling, it's incredibly understandable that Briony would never be able to reckon with the other side of the story, because that wasn't the life that she lived. You know, ultimately her life went on. She started to realize what it was she had done. It was her sister and her sister's lovers' lives who were also directly destroyed, and that she had more of a connection to. So she was focused on trying to make it right for them. But it is just the fact that it's an uncomfortable reality for her, that what she's seeking atonement for is ultimately what she did to her sister and to Robbie in particular, destroying the life of an innocent man with a false accusation. There's a larger conversation to be had about what else she could have done to atone. And I think that the movie kind of picks its lane, because you can't cover all of that in a single story. And I think what it does reckons with incredibly well. It's just, you know, ultimately we'll get into at the end of this discussion, the question about whether or not Briony actually is able to achieve the atonement and the forgiveness that she seeks, if she even wants it. It's a very interesting question, but ultimately in the beginning, it's about the fact that she is reckoning with the damage that's been done to her sister and Robbie's life, because that's what she's most directly responsible for. Whatever her other sins, she is not responsible for what happened to Lola. That falls on Paul Marshall alone. And it's just a basic and upsetting fact that Paul Marshall gets away with it. And, you know, it's just something that the rest of the movie doesn't dwell on that. That's not the story it's focused on. But it doesn't mean there's no value in the story that it is telling. It's just the upsetting reality.
Yeah, and and that gets you have a larger conversation too about when you're telling a story. Is your responsibility to tell the story that you set out to tell, or is it your responsibility to have like a wider lens when it's dealing with this kind of subject matter? Because, you know, if we're following the story from Briony's perspective, and, you know, and the things that, you know, she's processing and what she's trying to atone for, it's just natural that, you know, her lens is limited to what's in front of her, and there's going to be other elements of the story that are on the periphery, and you know, and characters who come into the story and then leave it. And that's very much the case with Lola and Marshall. And your mind just races with the horror story that is Lola's life. And sometimes what you don't know is more terrifying than, you know, if we saw explicitly, like, you know, what's life at home with the Marshalls, and and it's just left for us to ponder. But I did want to make sure that we devoted some time to that, because you know, as has been said, we had hoped to have another perspective on the stream with us. We didn't get that, but wanted to make sure that we gave this subject its due, and it's just the reality of, like I said, the world has, is in a different place than it was 16 years ago. And, but, yeah, so, so diving, back into the story. So Robbie is taken away. And oh God, the heartache of, it's when we just hear Cecilia's mother scream out, Cecilia, when she goes running out to Robbie, and that music again, driving up the tension. And then as Robbie is driven away, and his mother comes out banging on the police car and yelling out, you liars, liars, liars. And we hear that ringing in our ears as we, see Saoirse Ronan's, version of Briony for the last time, and thus ends a brilliant tour de force of a, of a performance in this movie before it gets turned over to Romola Garai, and in the later section. But before that, we get Robbie in Dunkirk. And man, what a what a sequence this is, which is like a long march towards his death as his life is flashing before his eyes. I was really hit with watching it this time, just like how much the actual scenes of like walking through like the countryside and ultimately getting up to the beach is like, it's just like this hazy dream as he's just, thinking about, flashing back to meeting Cecilia in the diner, and their letters back and forth. And it's just, oh, it's so good. And this was actually my first time like learning about Dunkirk, seeing this film. And it's just so interesting. It just occurred to me today, though, I never put two and two together because I was so focused on that movie's connection to Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk. But Joe Wright revisits Dunkirk in Darkest Hour.
He does.
And so there's like, there's a little cinematic universe going on here. But I love this sequence, as like sad as it is. It's just, to see Robbie getting worse and worse and worse, and but we get, and I love the sequence with him and Cecilia in the diner, again focusing on the hands with the camera work as he's stirring, it's just beautiful. And then we really start to get the refrain that keeps coming back of when she says, Robbie, come back to me. And it's a way of like grounding him and calming him. And it's just, it's so sad. And the fact that that's the last time they see each other, in reality, is just so heartbreaking.
It's a retroactive gut punch, because the scene is heartbreaking enough in and of itself in the moment. Like, we're talking about the scene where Robbie and Cecilia finally reunite after Robbie has been released from prison, and what untold horrors he saw there are kind of left up to our imagination, even though Briony ultimately goes back and verifies the details of what horrors he went through. And Cecilia herself had seen even more horrors, because, as you alluded to, after Robbie is falsely accused and summarily sentenced and carted off to prison, Cecilia never doubts his innocence. She knows what happened. As she says to the investigator, I wouldn't necessarily believe everything Briony tells you. She's rather fanciful. Robbie being convicted on this primarily the strength of Briony's accusation is, you know, something that Cecilia, it never shakes her faith in Robbie because she knows this doesn't make sense. And that's why she is so still secure in her absolute love for him, to the point that she is like, you know what, I'm going to cut off all contact with my family because they were cowards. They closed ranks. My sister is the one who caused this to happen. So she basically never talks to her parents or her brother, or, as we may kind of learn later, her sister Briony ever again. You know, she goes and devotes herself to a life of service in the working as a war nurse for just care for the wounded. And when they come back together, like, there's just, it's beautiful filmmaking because there's so much unspoken tenderness and pain in that scene between Keira Knightley and James McAvoy. And you alluded to the hand touch. The moment when they're sitting there and Robbie's trying to be formal because it's been 3.5 years and he's not sure what Cecilia still feels for him. And then she just rests her hand on his, and you can see him like shudder with like just a release, because that's probably the first time he's been touched in that way and since the last time they were together.
Yeah.
And it's almost too much for him to handle. It's just devastating, but she, like, it's such a tender act on her part. And Robbie, you can tell, was like in despair because his life has been destroyed. He's now about to be shipped off to war essentially against his will. And Cecilia becomes his lifeline in this scene because she still believes in him, she still loves him, and she is still willing to stand by him and wait for him. And that becomes the thing that will keep him alive for as long as it does. You know, the idea of like, come back to me, I'll wait for you, I love you. Like, it's the greatest inspiration that he could have to try and survive this horror that's happening to him. And when it comes to the Dunkirk sequence, it's, you know, it's beautiful filmmaking. You know, the 5-minute tracking shot is the stuff of legend. And as you alluded to, this is before Christopher Nolan kind of gave us a new perspective on Dunkirk with his, you know, acclaimed Oscar-nominated movie. But this sequence really kind of also shows the beauty and the horror of that sequence. And the thing that really stuck out to me this time during that sequence is just the sense of like Robbie's desperation to hold on, standing in for the desperation of all of these soldiers. And in particular, there's a line where I actually think the officer might be played by Tobias Menzies. It kind of looks like
it is.
But yeah, he's not in focus. It's very brief. But when Robbie catches up to him and he says that he's trying to get a sense of what happened, and he's like, I need to get home. And, you know, the guy, Tobias Menzies' officer, is basically like, wait your turn. You know, there are 300,000 men on this beach. But then he says what may be the most damning line, where he says, you're lucky you're not wounded. I've got orders to leave the wounded behind. And of course, Robbie is wounded. And he hides it because he can't be left behind. He doesn't want to be left behind. He needs to get back to Cecilia, but that becomes yet another compounding tragedy, because had he gotten treatment, maybe he would have survived and gotten back to her, but he doesn't. And it's just so devastating in retrospect.
I do want to mention, like some of the some of the bit players that pop up in this sequence, are just great. I'm trying to think of who the really talkative fellow soldier was, his name, but he's hilarious. He's got oh, you're muted.
It's Daniel Mays who plays Nettle. He was in, he's Tivik in Rogue One, among other things.
Okay.
And Nonzo Inozi, who plays Mace, famously Zaro on Duck Sauce, who we had also just seen in Spin to Watch Cinderella. This was an earlier role for him.
It's so funny. I wasn't sure like how widespread the duck sauce thing was, and I threw that out in our watch party for Cinderella, and I was like, I wonder who else is gonna get this, and you right away knew what I was talking about. Because I know I heard it a lot when I listened to Game of Bones back in the day. I remember because when his casting was announced for Game of Thrones, I recognized the face and the name because he's like the guy's got such a he's got a huge presence, and and even though he doesn't like, we don't really ever get too much of a close up on him, and he doesn't say a lot. But I definitely recognized him when his casting was announced. And as far as Tobias Menzies, it's such a great joy to see him in this, because I remember this is what I referred to as, it wasn't true because I'm sure he was getting lots of work over in England, but I referred to this as like the dark ages of Tobias's like casting, because I was always convinced that after he played Brutus in Rome, that he was going to be like this major, huge success, and he was going to get cast in everything because he was astounding in that show. And then for a good number of years, he just like, and I say a good number of years, it was only like 5 or 6 years, but I was younger and time stretched on more slowly. But it seemed like he was only getting like an occasional little bit role in like high profile stuff. Again, I'm sure he was getting more work, in the UK, which obviously this film is a UK movie. But so when he was cast in Game of Thrones and then he got cast in Outlander, it was like, yes, he's finally getting the attention he deserves. So it's funny to see him in his little bit role here, where if you aren't paying close attention, you could almost miss that it's him. But yeah, he's great, even though it's a quick small part. But yeah, it's just so sad just to see Robbie. He keeps moving. He doesn't want to, because he knows as soon as he slows down, like that might be it. And just to watch as I think the single most haunting shot in this movie is when, after they've been wandering around in the streets for a while and he's really losing it, getting further and further, like just out of it, and he's looking for what Cecilia told him about the cottage, and then his comrade is like, oh, here it is. And the saddest, most tragic shot is him walking down the stairs and just looking down. It's like he's descending to his death.
Yeah.
And it just rips my guts out every time I see the film.
Yeah, there are so many shots in this entire sequence, and Joe Wright has talked about this in some of the behind the scenes material, where they're basically filming Robbie as if he's like already like a member of the living dead, because right now the fever is burning through him. He has sepsis, even if he doesn't know it, from the shrapnel wound in his chest that he's not getting medical treatment for, because again, he doesn't want to be left behind with the rest of the wounded. But this is a sequence where it kind of becomes, almost a fever dream. And it's like, this is one of the sequences where, even for a movie about perception and memory and different like ideas about like what actually constitutes the truth, this is the one sequence where, that's brutal. You don't realize it at the time, but yes, that is in fact his last line.
Because it's preceded by, him joking around and being like, "I've decided to stick around for a bit," and so he's gonna be okay.
Yeah, and there's so much like tragedy in that, because ultimately, like, this is the moment where like the movie actually plays with like unreality as opposed to just like altered perspective of reality, because Robbie starts effectively becoming delirious and has like fever dreams. And there's like one of my favorite shots in the sequence is when he's in front of that movie screen, and he like the two lovers kissing, and he like is like puts his face in his hands, and you can't tell if he's like overwhelmed with emotion because he's feeling the loss of Cecilia so deeply, or if he's just like he can barely stand because of the fever that's ravaging him. I think it's probably a little of both. But this entire Dunkirk sequence is just like, it's elegiac, like beautiful filmmaking, but it's also like it gets to the scope of the tragedy, and like the movie just hammers it home, because this is the stage of the war, of course, when the British army is in full retreat from the advancing Nazis, and Dunkirk is this kind of mythological event in British culture. We in America haven't learned quite as much about it until recently, but like it's a retreat that's also a victory, because it allowed Britain to continue the war and ultimately win the war, that they were successfully able to do this. But in the moment, it felt like a devastating retreat. And Briony kind of gets into that, like the whole when her friend's like, they're making strategic withdrawals. She's like, I heard that. It's a euphemism for retreat. And of course, just getting home here is the victory. But there are a lot of soldiers who never made it off that beach, including, as we learned, Robbie. But that entire sequence where they're just even getting to the beach, it's just like you feel the pain of it so much. And this is when Robbie's like dictating his letters to Cecilia, because this is the only thing that's keeping him going, even as he is dealing with all the horrors of his past and also all the horrors that he's seeing. Like an underrated moment in this entire devastating is when he comes across all of these young, like schoolgirls who've been shot and just left for dead under the tree. And it's not clear who killed them or why.
Yeah, it's one of the most horrifying images I've ever seen, just because it's not dwelled on. There's no explanation for it at all. It's just,
Robbie like cries in that scene. We see like the tear coming down his face, and what is he crying for? For the loss of innocent life in that moment, for like everything that he's lost, for his fears about not seeing Cecilia again. I think it's all of them, because ultimately, as in the larger idea of retreat, withdrawal as victory here, for Robbie the victory would just be to get home, to get back to Cecilia. And he kind of talks about that in his speech, where he's just like, I will find you, love you, marry you, and live without shame. Like, retreating is not a shameful act to him here. He just wants and needs to get home to the woman that he loves, and that's all that she wants too. And of course, the brutal reality is that they're denied even that.
Yeah, it always just, it's so freaking sad. It just, when you think about it, like his final moments, when he's just dreaming of Cecilia, and we get the whole sequence where he's taken away, but it's played in reverse, and it just culminates in her going up to his ear and saying, I love you, come back to me. And that's all he wants to be able to do, and he's just never gonna leave that beach. it's just one of the saddest stories that I've ever seen. and just all the more like retroactively gut-wrenching just because we think that his story goes on from here, and of course it doesn't.
Which is just like pure unadulterated tragedy, and that this will tie into the ending when, you know, Briony talks about like what hope or sense of like meaning could be derived from an ending like that. I think that the movie could have chosen to tell this story, the book could have chosen to tell that story, but ultimately what it chooses to do with that tragedy is what gives the movie an extra layer of depth, because there is no other way to frame what's happening here. This is just pure tragedy. Robbie was an innocent man who was condemned for a crime he didn't commit. He was sent off to fight in a war he didn't want to fight, and he died. What could honestly be construed as like a purely wasteful death, and never got to reunite with the woman that he loved in life. And it's, you know, his story was just one of thousands who died, that ended on that beach and in that war. And
Yeah,
it's, you know, there is meaning.
And really, it's such a, and that paints such a stark contrast to Briony's, you know, perspective, at least starting off the story of her like being the center of the universe and nobody else is, you know, she's living the story and everybody else are just sort of, you know, bit players. Whereas we see through Dunkirk this image of Robbie and his story where he just dies so sadly alone, you know, unceremoniously, and he's just one of countless others, you know, and it's just, yeah. I do want to say another thing about just the sequence. Like, you know, we talked about the film Dunkirk, and what I love so much about the way that this film illustrates Dunkirk is just the sense of disorganization and what a mess the beach was, and it just seems so much more like hell. You know, and I love what the camera does, the tracking shot, and the way it then goes up to the soldiers who are singing and comes back around them, and after you've seen all this devastation, comes back to Robbie as he turns around and, you know, to face the camera. It's some of the most beautiful camera work you know, I've ever seen, and it's just unfortunate that this was a year of stiff competition at the Oscars. Even though, as I said, I think Atonement should have gotten more nominations than it did. But as far as like the cinematography category goes, it was nominated, but it was up against, you know, even the movie that was favored to win, which was The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford. That's a title. You know, that was heavily favored to win, but it ended up losing to There Will Be Blood. You know, another like that was back in the days when it just was like, how many awards is oh God, what's the
Roger Deakins going to lose?
How many times is Roger Deakins going to lose Best Cinematography? And it seems like such a shoe-in, because if you've ever seen The Assassination of Jesse James, it is one of the most gorgeously shot films ever. But you can say that about any movie that he's shot, and it wasn't until Blade Runner 2049 that he finally won. But then you look at There Will Be Blood and you're like, oh my God, that's a gorgeous film too. And so, you know, it's just, you know, it had some great competition. So I don't think it's too much of a shame that that this film didn't win the award, but still it's got stunning cinematography, especially in this sequence.
Yeah, and so we will shout out Seamus McGarvey, who is the cinematographer. I looked. He wasn't the cinematographer on Pride and Prejudice. It was Ronan Hassan, but obviously, Joe Wright and Seamus McGarvey's gone on to work with Joe Wright on other projects as well, including Anna Karenina. Yes, absolutely. This is one of the strongest years for film that we have in recent record. And Atonement is part of that. This is like we haven't talked as much about like the absolutely gorgeous craft of this filmmaking, but like the Dunkirk sequence is just some of the best camera work and score and and honestly like background extras acting that you'll see, because it's like it really gives you a sense of the horror and chaos of the situation.
And as far as like costume design, obviously we talked a lot about the green dress, but
yes,
but throughout the film, the costume design, is just off the charts amazing. The crafts work, the craftsman work, across the board for this movie is just outstanding. And it's
there is so much that we can laud about that, but I actually think one of the ways to transition and bring that in is we talked a lot of, and Eric mentioned in the chat how many Robbie Turners died on that beach. One of the ways we kind of get a sense of that is when we transition back to England, to London, and to the hospital where Briony is working. And this is another example of like just great stage setting and costume work and makeup and everything, because as horrific as the Dunkirk scene is, this scene is honestly even more so, because this is where we see like the very real consequences. This movie doesn't have like a true like battle sequence, but it has the aftermaths of it. Like, and this is where we catch up with Briony, now played by Romola Garai, as you see on the screen there. And it's a critically important section of the movie. But I did want to shout out the craftsmanship of this entire, hospital set sequence is like one of the best sequences of like such a combat hospital in wartime that you'll see on screen. But obviously it has very real thematic power as well.
Not to jump ahead, but just one of the most powerful scenes in this film is when she's sitting next to the soldier, who's about to die, and he's missing a significant part of his skull, and just the way that she is with him, and then when she goes to loosen up the bandages without realizing like the extent of his injury, the terror, the panic and terror on her face as she's trying to keep her calm for him, and as she bandages him back up, and I love at the end of their conversation, like shortly before he passes away, when and he's not aware of who she is, but he thinks that she's somebody he knew, and the way when he says they're speaking in French, and and he's saying, "Do you love me?" and without like missing a beat, she right away goes, "Oui," yes, and it's just, it's so gut-wrenchingly powerful and it's hats off to that that actor, just for we meet him just in this instant, and he does such a great job.
Jeremy Renier is the actor's name, and playing Luc Cornet, the dying French soldier. It's an essential scene, like, and Romola Garai in this scene is also like, she doesn't get quite as much acclaim as Saoirse Ronan or even sometimes Vanessa Redgrave, probably because she's just not as well known of an actress, but she is amazing in these scenes. and never more so than at the scene when she's at the bedside of the dying Frenchman, because we've now established that Briony is older. She's 18. She has turned down her place at Cambridge. She's working at the wartime hospital, which Cecilia rather dismissively calls like her attempts at penance, not atonement, penance, basically punishing herself for what she did. But we see that Briony is starting to learn, lessons. She is starting to realize the consequences of her actions, and also the fact that there are other people who have minds that are very real and as important as hers. And she's starting to try to show a little bit more of that humanity and compassion, because when we catch up with her, the ward sister is basically taking her to task for daring to use her name when talking to a wounded soldier. She's like, "You are Tallis, there is no Briony." And that's her attempt to maintain layers of rigid professionalism. But we see Briony tries to take it to heart. She looks in the window and says, "There is no Briony." She's trying to teach herself to be more, to not to insert herself into the story, to be more like of a passive, not passive in her actions. She's working very hard, but like not to insert herself as a figure into these stories. But she's still writing, we see, and we'll catch up with what that means. But when she's at the bedside of the dying soldier, that humanity starts to crack through again, and she does start to show more compassion. Like she's instructed to go in there and hold his hand as he dies, but she also starts to give him the words of comfort that he needs to hear as he passes. And this is really one of the first instances that we see of what will become critically important later in the movie, of her using the power of storytelling, of her lies, or just truth, not exactly as it is, to give someone a small modicum of happiness that they would otherwise be denied.
And it's a less selfish form of that, because she's doing it to bring peace to the soldier, in his final moments. And so, and we'll talk about in a little bit, but there's a lot to discuss and where she ultimately arrives. But I think, and I think it means a lot that when, she says her name is Briony, at the end, the head nurse doesn't take her to task for that, because, it's, I think she can see that, it was done for the right reasons, in that moment. It's as a phrase that Briony will use later. It's a final act of kindness.
Yeah, and this is probably the most selfless act of compassion that we see from Briony throughout this entire movie. Everything else is kind of like very morally gray in certain aspects. This is her actually, doing something purely as a duty, but also it is a true act of compassion and of kindness to give this to this dying soldier, so that he can be at peace as he passes from this world. And it's purely, there's not really anything that she is doing for advantage here. I mean, she may use it in the story one day, but that's not why she's doing it right now. She's doing it because she feels compassion in this moment for another human being, for a mind other than her own, a dying mind, and she wants to give it what it needs in that moment. And so it's again outstanding acting from Romola Garai in the scene.
She always gets the short end of the stick with this movie, because she's the middle Briony, but this entire section of the film is so crucial, as is her performance. So especially, we're not quite there yet, but the scene later on between Briony, Cecilia, and Robbie, I think that Romola is just out of this world amazing in that scene. But yeah, and we're given a lot of we're able to fill in the blanks of what's happened during the passage of time, like when she has the conversation with the other nurse, when she's typing away, during the night, and we get the sense that that she's been able to sort of process and understand what she did, just as she's growing up and she's understanding things a bit more clearly. And this is also the part where, and if we think about the fact that Briony is telling this part of the story to us, this is where she inserts the flashback between her and Robbie, and and that illustrates kind of what her state of mind is about, maybe subconscious, things that she wasn't even thinking about, leading to what she did. And I think a lot of this section of the movie is she's condemning herself a lot.
Yeah.
It's the entire confrontation scene later on is she's really letting herself have it, because I think the way that Robbie reacts is perhaps not quite as from what we know of Robbie, he may or may not have responded that way, but I think it's Briony's need to really have to lash out at herself for her actions. And yeah, so I think that's the part where you can really the interesting, the way you can analyze this about she's telling a story about herself in these scenes, and everything has a point and a reason to illustrate what she is sort of going through mentally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so she clearly has more of an understanding about what happened, and she's doing some self-reflection, as you mentioned, the flashback where she thinks back to the time that when she was consumed with ideas about fanciful knights and princesses and rescues, when she jumped in the brook and essentially asked Robbie, would you save me if I did this? And he's like, of course I would. And then she does it to make him prove that he would do it, and he does it, but he's not willing to play along with her fantasy of when she's like, you saved my life, I shall be eternally grateful. And he's like, why the hell did you do that? You could have killed us both. Oh, delicious, sad foreshadowing there. It's the moment that really kind of breaks her fairy tale like understanding of that dynamic, and also perhaps kind of breaks her infatuation with Robbie, because she does tell her friend Fiona that like at one point she had a crush on a boy, Robbie, but the moment I told him, the feeling sort of faded. And that's kind of a little bit of what we see, where she realized that Briony, by her own admission, has never been in love at this point in her life. She doesn't know what it's like, and this is her acknowledging that she doesn't, and the fact that she didn't understand what her sister Cecilia and Robbie had, and the depth of feeling they had for each other. She's attempting to figure it out now, but it's going to take her a lifetime to do that, and she's going to have to ultimately fill in some of the pieces of that herself.
Yeah. Yeah, and trying to think of other things because we did talk a bit about when she attends the wedding, and there's just that build up to when Marshall's face is revealed, and in her mind, and it's filling in those blanks, and I'm just trying. I don't want to rush through all the stuff because part of me is just itching to get to the confrontation scene, and but I want to make sure I do this section justice. And you mentioned the hospital scene earlier when all the soldiers are being brought in. There's a great moment when she sees Robbie for a second, but then of course he's not there, as we well know. But at that point we're thinking that he's pulled through, and so we're eager to believe that he would be among the survivors. But and there's a great scene where the other nurse is just like overwhelmed and crying like in the corner while all this stuff is going on, which really just paints the picture of how like just horrifying it all is with all these terribly injured soldiers coming in, and again, like I'm gonna say the billionth time, but the score, it's just so great over all this. No, I'm just delaying the inevitable. Let's just get to the
let's just get to it, because it is the essential crux of the movie, this scene.
Just when she she goes there, and Cecilia comes outside, and there is just that moment of awkwardness between them, as Briony is trying to find the right words, but it's when she realizes, and of course none of this is happening, it's all Briony's invention, but within that, when she realizes that Robbie is there, and just the way she turns away instantly, and like she wasn't ready for this confrontation, and even the way that's constructed, it's designed so that subconsciously you deep down he's not actually there, that this couldn't have taken place, because those initial shots of him like coming into the room, holding Cecilia from behind, and then the way he sort of walks out real quick, it's almost like he's a figment. And again, just so beautifully shot and edited. And then the way Briony is preparing herself for him to come back out, and just the fury in him, which again is Briony. It's Briony punishing herself, and like everything that Robbie says is things that she feels she deserves. And but just the way he's like, what is she doing here? She wanted to talk. Oh yes, what about? And then she's like, about the terrible thing I did. And then he walked away fuming. And I could read verbatim the entire scene, but I'll just stop there. But needless to say, it's just and not that we feel that Briony, well, maybe some audience members did, but I think anybody with some sense would not necessarily feel that Briony completely deserves the treatment that she's getting here, but there is an element of of it being cathartic, of the fact that this terrible thing was done to Robbie, and this is him getting to really get that out and vent about that, and just I kept thinking, it was always one of the things that burned me about the fact that he didn't get a Best Actor nomination. It was the fact that like this was his Oscar clip. Just he says, how old do you have to be to know the difference between right and wrong? What are you, 18? Do you have to be 18 to own up to a lot? Just that whole speech is just, and James McAvoy just gets to unleash all this, pent up anger that's been, sort of not necessarily, because again, this isn't Robbie. This is Briony's invention of what Robbie would have been saying, but it's sort of under the surface for the whole film of what you know um what might be a natural reaction to what happens to him, and what she feels she deserves. But it's a brilliant scene that culminates where Cecilia grabs hold of him, and and again, come back to me, and it's oh, it's such a magnificent scene.
It's beautiful. Like that scene where Cecilia goes to calm Robbie down and is touching his face and going to catch him. You don't realize it, but that's one of the posters for the movie. They obviously, frame it slightly differently, but like, God, you can just see the utter and complete love she has for him there. Like her willingness to just be there for him in that moment as he's dealing with the PTSD he's suffering from, and the justifiable anger at everything that's happening to him. And he's scary in that scene. Like he tells Briony, I don't know if I should break your neck right here or throw you down the stairs, which is a dark thing to say. Obviously, as you alluded to, this is ultimately Briony putting those words into his mouth. But as Cecilia is there, like Cecilia is kind of like his angel in this scene. Like, Keira Knightley is generally an angel, but in this scene, she really is framed in an angelic kind of way. And she's very devoted to trying to help Robbie in this scene. And like, this is what she would have been for him if she'd gotten the chance. And, one of the moments that always sticks with me is when Briony finally comes into the apartment, and Cecilia is like there, but not like hasn't fully engaged Briony yet. And then Robbie is walking through, and then Cecilia or Briony sees like their shared bed, and Cecilia just says quietly, "He sleeps so deeply," and you're just like, I mean, obviously there's a double meaning there, as we know, but he's having the deepest sleep of all. But Cecilia herself, like just the idea that like the man that she loves would be like able to sleep peacefully when he's with her, like it's a beautiful idea. And Keira Knightley, I feel like we haven't talked about her enough in this Knights of Keira stream, but we will get there.
Well, it's just because so much of this, as much as we could have, but it wouldn't have been true to what the film is, which is Briony is the central figure of the film. But you said that she's angelic in this scene, and that's so much of like Briony is definitely painting this beautiful a love story culminating in this scene. And so much so that when it cuts to the outside shot showing them through the window, they're embraced in this wonderful Hollywood kiss, and that's just like it's a love story perfection. And but I mean, just look at this shot. Is it any wonder I'd fallen in love with her? Just
no. It is incredibly understandable, because I mean, she's gorgeous, but she's also like, in this scene, she is fully embodying a character who is very much light and hope and love and tenderness, and and the fact that this is ultimately a construct on Briony's part is part of the point, because this is a reflection of how Cecilia was in life, and it's also the best version of her, the version that we'll get to live forever. And so in that respect, it is very fitting, because Cecilia was this person. This does not feel like Briony like ultimately embellishing the story, as she later says. It's that like, this is her telling Robbie and Cecilia as they were, as they would have been, as they could have been had these events not happened. And it's and Keira plays that quality, like that ethereal quality, like that is a quality of her performance. That's not just, her screen presence. That's why her performance in this scene and throughout this movie is so masterful, because you're right. Ultimately, as we've said, Briony is the main character of the story. There is an entire sequence that's focused on Robbie. Keira kind of only, as Cecilia, only is present as like the vision and the memory in that scene. She actually is out of this movie for prolonged stretches, but when she's on screen, she is radiant, not only like just by her natural presence, but by design. Like this is the filmmaking at work as well, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because really the closest thing we get to like a first person true, like look at Cecilia's throughout the first section of the film, because even though, again, working within the construct of everything is being told from Briony's point of view, she is kind of more of an active player in that first section. Second section, yes, she's in it, but it's all Robbie's recollections of her, and he's going, he's on the verge of death and sort of dreaming about her. So it's this, this vision of her that's just this, from that point on, it's like she becomes like this image of this angelic figure, which of course she is. And then that includes the sequence too, which is created by Briony, where, it's her, as you said, sort of a perfect, version of her. We've described her as an angelic, figure, in these moments. And I think that's very much, on purpose, for the way that, these characters are, because Robbie's coming from the perspective of, he's dreaming about her as, his, the lover that he wants to get back to. And Briony at this point is creating this, this version of Cecilia from knowing that, that she lost Cecilia, that Cecilia had in fact died. So it's, it's interesting what Keira is playing, in these latter parts of the film.
Yeah, and you finally said it. That's the thing that we had kind of not yet fully made explicit. Obviously, anyone who's seen the movie will know, but it is not part of the tragedy. Oh, and well said. No one plays a character quite like Keira Knightley, especially when she's being directed by Joe Wright. But I would say that the tragedy is compounded because, as we later learn, not only did Robbie die of septicemia on Dunkirk before he could be evacuated, it's not even the fact that Cecilia gets to live on and reconcile with Briony and perhaps find some other form of happiness later in her life. She is killed months later in the bombing of the Balham tube station during the Blitzkrieg, as the German Luftwaffe attacks London. And that was the part of the movie that I was not prepared for on the first watch. I knew kind of that, like, I had gotten the sense things weren't going to work out for Robbie as I was watching it. I was not prepared to see Cecilia die, especially in this way.
It's just so terrible. We've jumped ahead a little bit because there was still some more I wanted to.
Oh, we'll circle back.
Yeah, but it's the way Vanessa Redgrave just plays these revelations. She's saying, and so the scene in which, I confront them as imaginary, and of course that could never have happened because pause showed dead Robbie, and then the cover being pulled over him because Robbie Turner died of septicemia. It's just, and then as we're allowed to absorb that, and then she says, and I was never able to put things right with my sister Cecilia because she was killed on the 3rd of October. It's just compounding the misery of, of this, and yeah, it's just, I've said it like over and over. It's so damn sad. And
yeah, and
yeah, and I'm, yeah, it's like, you know, we've gone through, you know, Keira Knightley dying in her movies before, you know, in other stuff. Although not before this. I think this may have been like the first big one. But it's like it's just so much of this is tragic because it just seems like such a waste. You know, all these two wanted was like to carve out their little corner of happiness together, and they weren't allowed that.
Yeah, and the manner of death is, of course, like horrific. They don't dwell on like the details of it, but like we see the incredibly evocative imagery of Cecilia sheltering with her with other citizens of London in the tube station. Then we see the explosion that ruptures the water mains, and then we see the flood pouring into the tunnels, and we see her watching it come, and then it cuts away, and then we see her
Can I just
in the flooded tunnel.
Okay, and like we've described how tragic and sad it is, but can I just say, nobody dies looking as beautiful, you know, as she does. You know, it's like she does a great job of looking gorgeous while dying. Just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's generally gorgeous, and so you know she does everything better, and she does death scenes better than anybody else as well. But as Eric points out in the chat, in her last moment, Cecilia looked perfectly calm, like she was ready to die. That is an example of us not necessarily knowing if like Briony is just trying to like give her sister like that peace, because this is not a written scene. This actually happened. Cecilia did die in this way. She drowned in a flooded tube station, which is going to be a horrific way to go. But we don't actually see that. We see just her. We see it after she's already passed and she's floating in the water.
I take this. My interpretation is that we're seeing this as it happened because she's referring to the event, but she's not describing it in detail. So it's like, I think we're seeing the reality here. And I do want to say that I find it like, it's so haunting that this moment when Cecilia is floating in the water, you know, it harkens back to the beginning of the film with the fountain scene when she goes, you know, underwater. And it's just, like when you go back to watch the movie and you watch that earlier scene, you're like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, it's a beautiful parallel, and of course it goes to the idea that like water is essential for life. It gives life, but it also can take it, you know. And it ultimately ends up in tragedy, as Cecilia is one of many citizens who were killed during the Blitz. But in this case, we see her like floating in that very like angelic quality in the water and the horrific aftermath. And the fact that like it's not really established like whether or not she knew that Robbie had also died, or if that's something that was learned later. We just see like her final moment, and as Eric says, in that last moment she seemed calm, like she was ready to die. We don't know that for sure. We just know that like in this moment she seems to be like very much, you know, drifting off into memory. We see her kind of fade into the water in just one of the most haunting shots of the entire film. And it's the gut punch on once you're already reeling from the gut punch. It's like the double tap, because you just, that was like the last possible glimmer of hope before Briony kind of gives us another way to look at things in the end. But the idea that Cecilia herself is also going to die, like not reunited with her lover, not reconciled with her family, like her country under siege by an invading army, and like you're just left to wonder, like, what did she have? What was she thinking in these final moments? And it's almost too terrible to imagine. So,
yeah, I mean, it's really this film offers a very dim view of life in the world, because ultimately what you're left is like, what purpose did any of this serve? What meaning did it have? And it's just, which I think is, what Briony talks about in the end, what purpose, do readers derive from an ending like that, and so, yeah, it's,
yeah. And
um,
I think that's actually a perfect segue to talking about the ending, because one of the lines that really stuck out to me in that confrontation scene with Robbie and Cecilia and Briony is the end of it, when, of course, Briony is remembering, like, inventing all this, and some of this is just her, like, as you said, possibly punishing herself by imagining what Robbie would have said to her if he'd gotten the chance, and Cecilia as well. But is punishment truly atonement? Is it true justice? I would argue this movie says that no, it actually isn't. It's just another form of suffering, like, inflicted upon oneself and as well as others. But true justice has escaped them, because, as we alluded to, ultimately Paul Marshall is not going to be prosecuted for these crimes, and Robbie and Cecilia are not going to get their happy ending. But in this scene, there's the idea of possibly they could make Robbie's life better if she, were to recant her previous testimony. And so Robbie tells her something very important when he tells her, "Just do as I've asked of you. Write it all down. Just the truth. No rhymes, no embellishments, no adjectives, and then leave us be." And that's what she does, ultimately. In a different way than perhaps you got the original sense of the idea, but she takes her entire life to write this novel. And part of it is the idea, exactly as you said. This movie takes a very bleak view of, like, the suffering that is present in the world as a very real thing. But people have an inherent need to want to have some kind of emotional resolution, like, that gives them hope in storytelling. And she feels like this is something that perhaps she can do. And it becomes there's a larger question of, is this truly atonement for her? Like, ultimately the idea of, like, is it possible to forgive someone for something like this? Forgiveness, unless it's self-forgiveness, which it kind of feels like Briony may be reckoning with that possibility, although she says herself, I was not so, arrogant as to, like, make them forgive me in fiction. But this is kind of her apology, what she's doing here. She's never going to get true forgiveness from Robbie and Cecilia, because forgiveness takes two people, and they're dead. They can't give it to her. But is this a kindness for her? Like, is this truly atonement? Is this reparation? Is this just kindness, as she says? It's a
I flip back and forth so much about my read on the ending here, because I've gone through stages where I feel like, despite Briony saying she hopes this isn't the case, I've definitely gone through periods where I feel like this is an evasion on her part, where she's, you know, um, where she just can't bear to write down what actually happened, that she has to, use, rhymes and embellishments, um, and sort of as a way to attempt to forgive herself a bit. But then other times, I feel like she can't, that it's also in a way kind of selfless, because at least in the film version, she's, I know the ending of the book is different, but in the film version, she's still giving an interview where she's saying, this is what happened. So, you know, so she's not really running away from the truth, at least in this version of the story, because she's putting it out there. But she's allowing in some form for Robbie and Cecilia's story to have had the ending that, you know, that they wanted to have. And so I think in a way, at least in the film version, you know, I don't think she's necessarily running away from it. If you ask me about the book, I have a bit of a different feeling about that, because that feels, because we just kind of get her interior monologue, you know, telling us, you know,
Yeah.
what really happened. So, but yeah, it's a tricky thing, because, but she's, thing is, this is a person who's lived their entire life plagued by the guilt of what she did.
Yeah.
So the idea that she doesn't, that she can't just let this horrific, you know, ending stand, that at least in the form of literature, she can give, you know, Robbie and Cecilia, you know, as she puts it, what they lost out on in life. You know, it's in the grand scheme of things, it's not really enough, but it's the most she can do. And I do feel like it's different from, again, where she started out, of having her, you know, having a very selfish, like, I am the storyteller and I'm the most important part, you know, of the story, uh, versus this, where she's, you know, in a way relinquishing over to them, and making them the focal point, and, you know, and doing the small little bit that she can to try and, you know, do right by them. Um, but yeah, it's a very, I have a lot of complex emotions about where Briony ends up, and I don't know that I'm ever gonna completely know how I feel about it. All I know is that I feel tremendously sorry for her, because this is someone who has lived with this their entire life, and is now inching closer towards her own death. And as far as like what you mentioned about forgiving herself, I actually don't think she's ever going to forgive herself.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that's what's so sad about the whole thing.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you framed it that way, because it really gets into like, what was she actually seeking when she chose to write the book and write the story in this way. I agree. I don't think she was truly seeking forgiveness. And the idea of seeking atonement, like, just if you look at the dictionary definition of what that word is, it says like reparation for a wrong or an injury, the making of amends for a wrong one is done. But the idea that can she truly make amends to two people who are now dead? And as Eric says in the chat, you know, he says it's like she's holding their hand and telling them that she loved them, just like she did to the soldier earlier. And you had mentioned that, like, it may not be, you know, enough, but it's what she can do. I think that's it. You know, it's like she is, like, in her writing, you know, as her capacity as the author, she wields like the godlike power now. You know, she cannot appeal to a higher authority to seek forgiveness. It's never implied whether or not she's religious or not, but like, that's not the type of forgiveness that she's seeking. You know, she's not seeking absolution. She's seeking, you know, atonement. And Eric also mentioned in the chat earlier that, like, did Briony deny herself love and family because that's what she thinks she took from Robbie and Cecilia? Possibly. We don't see any implication that she ever married or she had kids herself. It's not really the point of the story. But that, if she did, that would not necessarily be atonement either. That would be punishing herself, because two wrongs don't make a right. Like, Robbie and Cecilia wouldn't necessarily feel like, good, you denied yourself love and happiness in the family when we didn't get it. Like, that's not their version of justice. They wanted to live and love and be happy together. So this is the way that she can try to give it to them. And the question of whether or not it's enough is something that really comes down to a matter of perspective, because it's, it is what she can do in her power as author, and like revisiting the idea that, she is wielding this power. Is she wielding it for good here? But what she is seeking of it, it's complicated by the fact that, as she tells the interviewer, she's dying. And she's like, I wrote this story now because I had to. And like, she was trying to write it her entire life. And the idea that this is going to be her last novel, there will be a time when she can't write this anymore. That's what opened her up and allowed her to finally write it. And also the idea that she finally gave herself permission to make a few embellishments and rhymes and, give them the happiness in fiction that they were denied in life. And that is something that ultimately it's up to us as the viewer. Was that enough? Because for Robbie and Cecilia in life, it wasn't. In fiction, it will. They will now live on forever in the minds of the readers as the happy reunited couple. Like, that is the power that Briony's word ultimately conveys, because her version of events is going to become the version that most people who never knew Robbie and Cecilia now think of when they think of them. And maybe that's her gift to them.
Yeah. And Joe Wright does something which, as a reader of the book, I will eternally thank him for, because in the book we just get, we get, the book as imagined, as told by Briony, with that confrontation scene, and then we get, it's a little bit different. The ending is a bit different, where I think there's a sequence back at the house where we actually see a performance of the trials of Arabella, which she was writing in the beginning. And everything that we learn is, basically her interior monologue. So we learn that Robbie and Cecilia died. And it's just this, like, I mean, the movie is sad and tragic, and the book is true to that, but what we don't get is a final imagined scene of Robbie and Cecilia, at the cottage on the beach, living out, the life they should have had. And it's both very tragic, because we know this is not what actually happened, but it's also, we get to, for the final moments of the movie, believe the lie, if we're so inclined. We get to end on these happy images, and also depending on your various interpretations and beliefs. There's certainly other interpretations you can have for what that final section means. But the imagery is very satisfying to see, even as it's also incredibly sad. And it's something we don't get in the book. And I was very grateful to Joe Wright for giving us that in the film, because in a sense it's cathartic just to see that. And
I think it's essential. Like, I don't have quite as clear of a picture of the ending of the book because I read it so long ago, but I do remember that this entire final section is essentially reinterpreted also in the sense that they're framing it as having her, like, talking to an interviewer, played notably by the late Anthony Minghella, who was an Oscar-winning director himself, whose life was cut tragically short. But it's one of the things where there are things you can do in a book, and then there are things you have to do in a movie to convey, the power of the intended ending. And if they had chosen to end the movie on Briony telling us and telling the camera, this is what I did in fiction, I gave them their happiness, and then the camera had cut to black there, we would have had a very different impression of the end of this movie. We would have been like, really? That's what you think? But
well, yeah, because her final line is, I gave them their happiness. And you have to show that happiness. Yeah. If you end on that line and it cuts to black, you're like, no, you didn't.
Yeah. But
they
do. The movie does. The movie does show us Robbie and Cecilia at that seaside cottage, dancing through the waves, holding each other, laughing, very much alive and in love. And even at this point, we know it's a fiction. It gives us comfort and catharsis to see that. And that's what allows us to open ourselves to the possibility that maybe this is something worthwhile for her to have done. Because, the ideas of our, stories in our collective consciousness, like stories live on long after we die and are passed from person to person, from generation to generation, and they gain meaning and power and weight with that each telling. And even if Robbie and Cecilia had lived on, and actually reunited in life, like their story would have continued, but like eventually they would have died and their story would have, been passed on, and it would have been, carried on and gained weight and meaning that way. They'll never get that in life because of the tragic circumstances that unfolded, but here they do get it. And it, in this way, like our best stories as living documents, as living history, having a life of their own, all these things that we say, in this way, they are immortalized. They will live forever, and they will live forever in this way, happy and together. And
if you doubt, and if you doubt her, that's the thing. If you doubt her words, in that respect, remember that what we're observing is a story being told. Like that's the entire, is sort of, if you step out of it, and not just as a plot device, but that's what we're witnessing in the real world. We're watching this as a story. And this, when I look back on this film, I really do think of these ending moments. And consciously, I'm aware of the fact that in the reality of the story, Robbie and Cecilia died tragically, but in my heart, this is their ending for me. Like these are the images that stick with me of them embracing each other in the room and in the in the imagined confrontation scene with that shot from the window of these images on the beach and them going into the cottage. And then we joked the other day about what happens after the camera cuts away. But no, so that right there, I think, proves the power of the words that she's saying, even though there's a part of me that is still like, oh, but are you still running away from? But even if she is, this is still a kindness, because there's no other way for her to, there's nothing else she can do. And to allow Robbie and Cecilia to live on in this way through the power of fiction as these, star-crossed lovers who get to have their happy ending, who get to, and not, this sort of image of, this perfect love story that's, we get, and their happiness that gets to endure. No, it's not what happened, in real life, but they get to be immortalized in this way. And like I said before, it may not be truly enough, but it's not nothing either. And it will be very powerful to all the people who come to that book, in years to come, just as it's powerful for those of us who come to watch this film. And there's a reason why, even beyond my, my never-ending, slightly worrisome crush on Keira Knightley, putting that aside, I've also been absolutely enamored with, as characters, Robbie and Cecilia for 16 going on 17 years. I think they're the ultimate tragic, lovers, because they didn't get the happiness that they deserved, in a cruel world. But through the power of fiction and cinema, I'll always remember them as getting their happy ending, dancing on the beach.
Yeah.
It's and so I think there is truth in what she says. We can debate you can debate, her motivations for that, and and sort of ultimately, is that purely an act of kindness, or is there some weakness on her part? But you can't argue the end result, which is that Robbie and Cecilia in some form are able to live on.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the most powerful ideas that I always find in any form of storytelling. Like, slight spoiler, we're going to be talking about this more next week with Pan's Labyrinth, because there is a very similar idea that I find very emotionally devastating and yet resonant and powerful in that movie. But for Cecilia and Robbie, they are tragic lovers, which is an archetype of storytelling that is very popular for a reason, and that gives them an almost mythic quality. And when we think about other famous love stories, we love Pride and Prejudice so dearly. Like we talked about, that is the ultimate all's well that ends well happy ending with Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. And
I know,
so
these two films are beautiful companion pieces, but they are also inverts of each other, in that our spirits are so uplifted by the end of Pride and Prejudice, and we're so driven down, into the dirt at the at the end of this film. But even that makes them even more wonderful companion pieces, just because they're not just would have been easy for Joe Wright to do his next film something very similar to Pride and Prejudice, and but the fact that there's a lot that carries over between the two films, but ultimately their stories are very the kind of stories they are, the tone of the story is very different.
And I find those endings very evocative and powerful, and the relationship to each other on the metatextual narrative of Keira Knightley and Joe Wright's filmography, but also just as contrasting story points about two people in love in that with the characters. And another, when you think about the archetypical tragic love story, your mind's going to go to Romeo and Juliet. That is the convention, of two people who were torn apart by circumstance and then ultimately can't be together, and it is a tragedy. And then there's ultimately the the act of contrition there is that their families realize that, like, we shouldn't have kept these two people apart. And that is what Briony is ultimately realizing here, the fact that she was the one who effectively separated Robbie and Cecilia. But I kind of feel like if there is a sense of true atonement and a true lesson learned for Briony in what she does here, it's the idea that even as the author and even as exerting control over the story as she does, ultimately what she does here is she takes a step back and she finally realizes that she is not the center of the Robbie and Cecilia's story. Their story was worth telling on its own merits as a beautiful love story that ended in tragedy. And her gift to them is that she, as Robbie says in that speech, write it all down, just the truth, no rhymes, no embellishments, no adjectives, and then leave us be. She had to create a little bit of the embellishments and fiction to give them that happy ending, but then she does take a step back. She doesn't make herself the center of the story, and her forgiveness is the center of the story. In the fiction itself, which is what people will actually read in this fictional book, they do get their happy ending. She removes herself from the narrative, and Robbie and Cecilia are happy together. And that is what people will remember when they read this book. They will remember, Robbie and Cecilia. They will not necessarily remember Briony in the same way, but that is perhaps her sense of punishment for herself, or sense of atonement for herself, and also a sense of forgiveness for herself, if there is such a thing as possible, to allow herself to fade from the narrative, to extract herself from Robbie and Cecilia's story, and at least in this fictional moment, give them the happy ending that they needed and they wanted. And that is what people will hopefully remember from her book, Robbie and Cecilia in love together, and together they are infinite.
Yeah. Well, 3 hours and 40 minutes. I don't think we could have done a more comprehensive discussion of a 2-hour film. But given the length of our other streams, over the past couple months, it's was inevitable that we'd take our time on this one. And like I said earlier in the stream, it's been a long time coming. And I'll just I know what I'll do. I'll finish off by doing some more show and tell. I will say I have these beautiful Blu-rays of both Pride and Prejudice and Atonement that when they initially came out, and they had these special golden Oscar covers.
Oh, those are so good.
Yeah. And as you said, that was one of the poster images, and there you go. And I also have the book that came out, when the movie came out. It was the tie-in edition.
Yep, I have the same copy.
Very happy to still have that. I also have the shooting script for it. And I showed this before, probably when we did that Pride and Prejudice stream, like way back in the day. But I'll show it again. This is not Atonement related. This is Pride and Prejudice, but this was a 4-year consideration booklet that came out. I got this off of eBay a number of years ago, and basically the whole book is just like promoting the movie and showing what categories it's up for. You got this nice spread where they were putting it up for all the big awards, which, sadly it only got 4, but what are you going to do? I will say one really cool thing is, there's lots of cool things. Right here is the letter that Darcy writes to Elizabeth about halfway through the movie.
That is cool.
Yeah. So I'm very happy to have that. This is when I was desperate to get my hands on like special collector's items for Pride and Prejudice. And yeah, so I was very happy to get my hands on that. But oh, thank you, Weezy. Yeah, I'm very happy to have that stuff. You know, sadly, there's not a line of, you know, like Pride and Prejudice and Atonement action figures that I can buy. But, you know, I do what I can. But yeah, I'm really glad we got to sit down and talk about this one. It's like I said, Atonement and Pride and Prejudice really go hand in hand for me, just because you know, it was a couple years where I was just over the moon, you know, in my, you know, going crazy as a fanboy for Keira Knightley. Again, I say all this stuff like this in the past tense. I'm still that way.
Very much so.
Yeah, but you know, this was the start of it all, and I just remember, you know, how much I was looking forward to the film, and then when it came out, I was just so blown away by it. And yeah, yeah, I know. It's like, you know, you'd think that, you know, the market for the action figures would be, you know, off the charts, but apparently not. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just rambling at this point. What final comments do you have, Jerry?
Just that I'm so glad that we finally got the chance to talk about this movie, and we got to talk about it in such depth. I hope that you all enjoyed the conversation as well. We had to talk about some dark subject matter, particularly in the middle. Thank you for allowing us to do that. If you feel like we put a wrong foot somewhere, or you want to contribute to the conversation, please do reach out to us and like let us know, because, you know, we want other voices on this topic. We had to do it justice ourselves, but I hope that within the picture of the entire movie, you got a sense that the story is so much more than that. One of the reasons we talked about this 2-hour movie for 3 hours and 45 minutes is because we find it so incredibly thematically rich and powerful, and there are so many interesting ideas to dig into. And even though we framed it as a Knights of Keira stream, which it very much is, you know, we didn't focus quite as much on Keira Knightley herself, even though she's outstanding in this movie, and primarily, as we said, because she is ultimately not the central character. But when I think of Keira Knightley movies, I will always think of Pride and Prejudice first, because that is the quintessential Keira Knightley movie. It is my favorite of her performances. I love it dearly. I think it is her best performance, and it's a very important movie to us both. I also think of Pirates of the Caribbean because that's so much fun. But I will also always think about this movie because I do think that even if she is not the central focus of it, it is one of her very best performances and one of her very best movies. And, you know, in her filmography, this film stands very tall. I'm so very glad that she got a role like this. And, you know, I think it was an important film for her at this point in her career. And I will always, you know, value it and love it, even, and reckon with it, you know, for many years to come. I think it is a beautiful, brilliant piece of cinema, even with all the dark elements that we went into. And I just am glad that we finally got to pay tribute to it in that way.
Yep, and I'm just gonna put all the Keira pictures that I have for this film. I may have gone a little overboard, but
no such thing. Not with Keira Knightley. Not on the Knights of Keira streams.
Yeah, it was a difficult thing because as I mentioned earlier, like we don't really get a section of this movie that's like strictly a Cecilia point of view. There's a little bit of that in the first section of the movie, which is kind of, you could, it's, I guess it's mostly from young Briony's point of view, but I feel like it's kind of spread evenly throughout the characters in that first section. But the second act is purely Robbie's perspective, and then the third act is older Briony's perspective. So Keira is for the most part playing a supporting role in this film, but she's just got such an amazing presence in the film that it's like that's why they were campaigning her for lead actress that year, just because Oh, but yeah, I'm just using up time now. But
no, I think we can leave it there. The Knights of Keira have done Our Lady Liege justice, hopefully, by talking about this movie with the depth and care that I hope I deserve. I feel we did. I hope that you all do as well. And we will be checking back in on her soon with hopefully a slightly happier movie, unless we're talking about Anna Karenina, in which case it will be more tragedy. But
yeah, Joe Wright was like, "Oh, we got the happy stuff out of the way with Pride and Prejudice. Let's just keep going dark." That's why they need to do at least one more movie together, because they need to veer back towards the happy stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But yes, Cecilia Tallis will live on, a vision in green, as Keira lives on, a vision in whatever costume she's wearing, because as we said, she is radiant in every role.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
All right.
I'll just finish on one of the most beautiful moments right here. But okay, yeah. Now I'm just like not even doing anything. I'm just being completely silent as I put these up. Anyway, so I hope you all enjoyed this stream, at least until it started to go off the rails within the last 2 minutes. But we'll be back next week talking about Pan's Labyrinth. And then the weeks ahead, we'll be celebrating Jared's birthday, which is on April 30th, but we'll be streaming on the 28th, talking about the film Before Sunrise. And then the week after that, we'll be tackling the last episodes of The Bad Batch.
Yeah. And we hope to see some of you there. Thank you for sticking with us all. I'm very honored that we still have you all in the chat talking with us about this movie.
Yeah, no, you guys are great. The fact that you stick with us through these, absurdly long streams, we feel very honored. So thank you, and we will see you guys next week. Hope you guys all have a wonderful night, and yeah, farewell. Bye.